Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Halloween fell on a Friday that year, and the whole neighborhood went crazy with decorations and kids everywhere. I had just turned 11 the month before, October 9th to be exact, and this was supposed to be the best Halloween ever because Mom finally let me go out without her tagging along. Just me, my best friend Colin, and his little brother Jesse, who was 9 and obsessed with collecting every single piece of candy he could get his hands on. We'd been planning our route for weeks, mapping out which streets had the full-size bars and which houses to skip because they gave out those weird religious pamphlets instead of treats. Colin's mom made us promise to stay together, check in every hour, and be back by 9 o'clock sharp. We agreed to everything because we were just so pumped to be out on our own, hitting the streets with our pillowcases already in hand, ready to score the mother load. The night started off perfect. We went as a group costume. The three of us dressed up as different horror movie characters. I was wearing this zombie getup my older sister helped me with, complete with fake blood and torn clothes. Colin went as a werewolf with this insane mask his dad got from a Halloween store in the city, and Jesse was a tiny vampire with plastic fangs that kept falling out of his mouth every time he said trick or treat. We hit house after house, and our bags got heavier and heavier. The weather was cold enough that you could see your breath, and the street smelled like fallen leaves and someone's chimney smoke. Every house was lit up with jack-o'-lanterns, some of them carved into crazy detailed faces, others just simple triangles for eyes. We were laughing and running between houses, comparing our hauls, and Jesse kept trying to sneak candy out of his bag, even though we all agreed to wait until we got back to Colin's place to do the official candy swap. Around 8:30, we decided to hit one last street before heading back. Sycamore Road, the one that bordered the community playground where we played basketball in the summer. The houses there were older, kind of run down compared to the rest of the neighborhood, with overgrown yards and peeling paint on most of the porches. We almost skipped it entirely because the streetlights were dim, and it looked pretty dead, but Jesse insisted because he heard from a kid at school that someone on that street gave out king-size Snickers bars. So we went, walking down the cracked sidewalk with our bags dragging behind us, already so full they were getting hard to carry. Most of the houses had their lights off, which usually means they're not participating. But there was one place about halfway down that had a single porch light on. No decorations, no carved pumpkins, nothing festive at all. Just that one yellow bulb buzzing above a dark green door. Colin said maybe we should skip it, but Jesse was already running up the driveway, so we followed. The guy who answered the door was old, probably in his 70s, with this wrinkly face and deep-set eyes that looked almost black in the shadows. He wore a cardigan that had seen better days and house slippers, and when he opened the door, he didn't smile or say anything at first. He just stared at us for a few seconds like he was sizing us up or deciding whether or not we were worth his time. Then he reached into a plastic bowl sitting on a table right inside the doorway and dropped a handful of candy into each of our bags without saying a word. Jesse shouted thank you, his voice all high-pitched and excited, but the old man just nodded once and shut the door before we even turned around to leave. Something about the whole interaction felt weird, but we were kids on a sugar high, and we didn't think much of it. We just moved on to the next house, which had its lights off, so we turned back toward Collins Street, ready to finally dig into our loot and start the trading process we'd been waiting for all night. When we got to Colin's house, his mom had already set up the living room for us. She'd spread out a big blanket on the floor and put out 3 bowls so we could sort our candy by type. The rule was simple. We each dumped our bags out, organized everything into categories, and then we'd trade until everyone was happy. I always traded away my Almond Joys because I hated coconut, and Colin would give up his Smarties because he said they were just compressed sugar that tasted like chalk. Jesse was the pickiest. He only wanted chocolate, specifically anything with caramel or peanut butter. We started sorting, making piles of chocolate bars, gummy candy, lollipops, and the random stuff like popcorn balls or homemade cookies that some of the older ladies in the neighborhood insisted on handing out. Jesse grabbed a chocolate bar from his pile, one with a dark brown wrapper that looked like it might be a Hershey's or something similar. He didn't even ask if anyone wanted to trade for it, just ripped the wrapper open and took a huge bite, chocolate smearing on his vampire fangs. Colin and I were too busy negotiating over a pack of Reese's cups to pay much attention to him at first. Maybe 30 seconds later, Jesse made this choking sound. Not like he was actually choking on the candy, but like something tasted so bad it made him gag. He spit the chocolate out onto the blanket, this gross brown glob mixed with saliva, and his face went pale. I mean really pale, even under the white vampire makeup he was wearing. He said it tasted like soap, like really strong chemical soap, and his mouth was burning. Colin's mom came rushing in from the kitchen because she heard the commotion, and she asked Jesse what was wrong, but before he could even answer, he lurched forward and threw up all over the blanket. It wasn't just a little bit either, it was violent, like his whole body was rejecting whatever he'd just eaten. The vomit was dark and had this strange smell to it, not the usual puke smell, but something sharper, almost like bleach or cleaning fluid. Colin's mom completely panicked. She grabbed Jesse by the shoulders and asked him what he ate, and he pointed at the half-eaten chocolate bar still in his hand, the wrapper lying next to it on the floor. She snatched the wrapper up and examined it, but there was no brand name on it, just plain brown paper that looked like it had been hand-wrapped. That's when I remembered the old man on Sycamore Road, how he just grabbed a handful of candy from that bowl, without even looking at what he was giving us. Colin's mom called 911 immediately, her voice shaking as she explained that her son's friend had eaten something and was now vomiting uncontrollably. Jesse kept throwing up, he couldn't stop, and between heaves he was crying and saying his throat hurt, that it felt like it was on fire. His lips started looking swollen and red, and there were these weird white patches forming at the corners of his mouth. I felt completely helpless, just sitting there watching my friend suffer, and Colin had backed up against the wall with tears streaming down his face. The ambulance showed up maybe 10 minutes later, but it felt like hours. The paramedics came rushing in with their equipment, asking questions rapid fire while they checked Jesse's vital signs and looked at the chocolate bar wrapper. One of them held it up to his nose and sniffed it. Then his expression changed. He told his partner something I couldn't quite hear, but I caught the word chemical. They loaded Jesse onto a stretcher and took him out to the ambulance, and Colin's mom went with them after telling us to stay put and that she'd call our parents. She grabbed the rest of Jesse's candy bag before leaving, and she took the chocolate wrapper with her. Colin and I just sat there in the living room, staring at the mess on the blanket, neither of us knowing what to say. The whole house smelled like vomit and that chemical odor, and all the candy we'd been so excited about suddenly looked dangerous, like any piece could be hiding something terrible inside. My mom showed up about 20 minutes later, her face tight with worry, and she made me show her every single piece of candy I'd collected. We went through it, item by item, and she threw away anything that looked homemade or had a wrapper that seemed off. When we got home, she called the police non-emergency line to report what had happened, giving them the address on Sycamore Road where we'd gotten the candy. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Jesse and wondering if he was going to be okay, replaying the sound of him choking and gagging in my head. The next morning, Colin's mom called to tell us that Jesse was stable but still in the hospital. The doctors had run a bunch of tests and found traces of ammonia-based cleaning solution in his system, the kind you'd use to scrub bathrooms or kitchen floors. They'd had to pump his stomach and give him medication to protect his throat and esophagus from the chemical burns. He was going to survive, thank God, but he'd be in the hospital for at least a few more days under observation. The police had gone to the house on Sycamore Road early that morning and questioned the old man who lived there. His name was Howard Pruitt, and apparently he'd been living alone in that house for over 15 years after his wife died. Neighbors said he was always complaining about kids cutting through his yard or making noise near the playground, calling them vandals and troublemakers, even when they were just playing. The police searched his house and found a whole stash of candy in his kitchen, chocolate bars that he'd carefully unwrapped, coated with a diluted cleaning solution using a paintbrush, and then rewrapped in plain brown paper. He'd made dozens of them. When the police confronted him, Howard didn't even try to deny it. He admitted everything, said he'd only wanted to teach the kids in the neighborhood a lesson, to scare them into staying away from his property. He claimed he'd diluted the cleaning solution enough that it wouldn't kill anyone, just make them sick enough to think twice about trick-or-treating near his house again. He actually seemed annoyed that the police were making such a big deal out of it, like he couldn't understand why poisoning children was considered a serious crime. The detective who interviewed him said Howard kept insisting he wasn't trying to hurt anyone permanently, that it was supposed to be non-lethal, just enough to cause discomfort. But the medical report showed that if Jesse had eaten the entire chocolate bar instead of just one bite, or if a smaller child had eaten it, the outcome could have been fatal. The ammonia concentration was higher than Howard claimed, and the doctors said Jesse was lucky he'd spit most of it out, and that help arrived quickly. Howard Pruitt was arrested and charged with attempted poisoning, reckless endangerment, and distribution of adulterated food. The news spread through town like wildfire, and suddenly every parent was in a complete panic. Within days, the local news picked up the story, and it became this huge cautionary tale about Halloween safety. Parents who'd let their kids eat candy on the walk home were now horrified, realizing how close their own children might have come to the same fate. The elementary school sent out letters to every family, and the PTA organized a meeting about trick-or-treat safety that packed the gymnasium. People started talking about only going to houses of people they knew personally, or skipping Halloween altogether next year. Some parents took their kids' entire candy hauls to the police station, where they'd set up a voluntary screening area with officers checking wrappers and looking for anything suspicious. Our local hospital offered free candy x-rays for anyone who wanted them. The whole town became obsessed with the idea that there could be more people like Howard out there, more tainted candy sitting in kids' pillowcases and plastic pumpkin buckets. I had to go to the police station with my mom to give a statement about what happened, describing the house and Howard's behavior when he answered the door. Colin and I both told them everything we could remember, even small details like the color of his cardigan and the way he'd stared at us before handing over the candy. Jesse came home from the hospital 5 days later, and when I saw him at school the following week, he looked different, thinner, quieter, and he didn't want to talk about what happened. His parents had hired a lawyer and were pursuing a civil lawsuit against Howard on top of the criminal charges. Howard Pruitt ended up pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for avoiding a trial, and the judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison plus probation. The house on Sycamore Road sat empty after that, with a for sale sign in the yard that stayed there for over a year before anyone bought it. Halloween was never the same for me after that night. Even now, years later, I still think about it every October when I see kids in costumes going door to door. I think about how something that's supposed to be fun and innocent can turn into a nightmare in seconds, how someone's bitterness and anger can poison more than just chocolate bars. Jesse never went trick-or-treating again, and honestly, I don't blame him. That smell of chemicals mixed with vomit still hits me sometimes out of nowhere, and I'm right back in Colin's living room, watching my friend suffer because some old man decided that scaring children was an appropriate response to his loneliness and resentment. The whole experience taught me that monsters don't always look like the ones we dress up as for Halloween. Sometimes they're just regular people who've let their worst impulses win. We'd been in Forest View for about 3 months when October rolled around, and honestly, I was still getting used to the whole suburban thing. Our old place in Wisconsin had maybe 20 houses scattered along a county road, so this neighborhood with its neat rows and HOA rules felt like a different planet. My little brother Ethan was 11 and had already made friends at his new school, which was more than I could say for myself. High school as the new kids sucked, especially when everyone had known each other since kindergarten. But that night, Halloween night, Mom handed me a flashlight and told me to take Ethan trick-or-treating while she stayed back to hand out candy. He'd been planning his route for weeks, had this whole map drawn on notebook paper with houses circled in red marker, based on intel from kids in his grade about who gave out the good stuff. He was dressed as a ninja, complete with a plastic sword and those weird toe shoes, doing these exaggerated kicks every few steps that made me want to walk 10 feet behind him. We headed out around 6:30, right when the sky was doing that deep purple thing before going fully dark. The air had that perfect autumn chill, and you could smell wood smoke from someone's fireplace mixed with the sugar-sweet scent of candy. Little kids in costumes were already swarming the sidewalks, parents trailing behind with flashlights and those orange pumpkin buckets. Our street, Pinehurst Drive, curved into a cul-de-sac at the far end, and most of the houses there had gone all out with decorations. Fake cobwebs, motion sensor witches, those inflatable yard displays that looked impressive until you saw them deflated the next morning. But there was one house at the very end that was completely dark. No lights, no decorations, nothing. Just this beige two-story colonial with bushes that had grown wild enough to scratch against the windows. When we were hitting the 4th or 5th house, this woman passing out candy, maybe in her 40s with a sweater that had a cat wearing a witch hat on it, leaned toward us and said, "You boys can trick or treat anywhere you want, but skip that last house. The people there don't celebrate." The way she said it wasn't casual. It was a warning, the kind adults give when they're trying to sound calm but actually mean business. Of course, telling Ethan not to do something was basically guaranteeing he'd obsess over it. For the next hour, as we hit house after house, and his pillowcase got heavier with candy, he kept circling back to that dark house at the end. Why don't they celebrate? Are they mean? What if they're just old and forgot to turn the lights on? I tried explaining that some people just don't participate, that maybe they were religious or just didn't like kids, but he wouldn't let it go. By the time we'd covered most of the cul-de-sac and the crowds were thinning out, it was almost 8:30. The younger kids had gone home, and the teenagers who were too old to trick-or-treat but did it anyway were starting to roam around in packs. Ethan stood at the edge of the dark house's driveway, staring up at it like it was some kind of challenge. The house looked even creepier now that the surrounding homes were lit up in contrast. Every other porch had candles or string lights, but this one was just a black void. "Come on, Caleb," Ethan said, already taking a few steps up the driveway. "Let's just check. Maybe they left candy out on the porch or something." I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back, telling him we should respect what the neighbors said, but he shook me off. "I just want to see if anyone's home. We don't have to knock or anything." There was this weird determination in his voice that I recognized from when he'd get fixated on beating a video game level or winning an argument. He wasn't going to drop it. I figured the quickest way to end this was to just walk up to the porch, show him there was nothing there, and leave. So I sighed, adjusted my jacket, and followed him up the cracked concrete driveway. Dead leaves crunched under our shoes, and I noticed the lawn hadn't been mowed in weeks. As we got closer to the front door, I could see a faint bluish glow coming from inside, flickering like a television. That's when I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It was open maybe 2 inches, just enough that you could see a sliver of the entryway inside. Ethan saw it too and immediately whispered, "See? Someone's home. They probably just forgot to close the door all the way." But something about it felt wrong to me. Not horror movie wrong, just off in a way I couldn't explain. Like when you come home and realize you left the stove on. That flutter in your chest. I told Ethan we should go, but he was already climbing the 3 wooden steps to the porch. The wood creaked under his weight, and I followed reluctantly, keeping my voice low as I called out, "Hello? Your door's open." Nothing, just the sound of the TV inside, playing what sounded like a local news broadcast. I knocked on the door frame, louder this time. "Hello? Anyone home?" Still nothing. Ethan pushed the door open a bit wider, and the hinges made this long, groaning sound that seemed way too loud in the quiet neighborhood. The entryway was dimly lit by the TV glow coming from what looked like the living room to the left. I could make out a coat rack, some shoes lined up against the wall, normal stuff. "We should call someone," I said, pulling out my phone. Maybe they had an emergency and left in a hurry. But Ethan was already stepping inside, his ninja sword bumping against the doorframe. "Ethan, what are you doing?" I hissed, but he ignored me, moving toward the TV light like a moth. I didn't want to leave him in there alone, so I followed, my heart doing this annoying hammering thing against my ribs. The living room was small and cluttered, with a brown couch facing a TV that was playing some news segment about traffic conditions. On the coffee table in front of the couch, I saw a large plastic bowl, the kind you'd put Halloween candy in, except it was tipped over on its side. Fun-sized Snickers and Milky Ways were scattered across the table and onto the floor, some of them still in that jumbled pile like someone had knocked the bowl over suddenly. Next to the bowl was a cell phone, screen down, and the little LED light on the side was blinking red. But what made my chest tighten was the phone's camera. The one on the back was facing up, and the screen, when I picked it up without thinking, showed a recording app. The timer read 43 minutes and 17 seconds. Someone had been recording. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone was doing a Halloween prank video and stepped away. Maybe they were filming themselves handing out candy and forgot about it. But the spilled bowl, the abandoned phone, the open door, none of it added up to a simple explanation. I was about to tell Ethan we needed to leave right now when I noticed the floor. There were footprints, muddy boot prints leading from the entryway past where we were standing and disappearing into the hallway that led toward the back of the house. They were large, definitely adult-sized, and the mud was still wet enough that it looked dark against the hardwood. I followed the trail with my eyes and saw they led to a door at the end of the hall, partially open. Even from where I stood, I could tell it was the basement door because of the darkness beyond it and the way cooler air seemed to drift out. Ethan had moved to the couch and was picking up some of the spilled candy, shoving a Snickers into his pillowcase like we were still trick-or-treating and this was all normal. "Ethan, put that down," I whispered urgently, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "We need to go, now." He looked at me like I was overreacting, holding up a Twix bar. "Why? No one's here, they probably went to a party or something." But I was staring at those boot prints at the basement door, and every instinct I had was screaming that we'd walked into something we shouldn't have. I grabbed Ethan's arm, probably harder than I needed to, and started pulling him toward the front door. That's when I heard it. A sound from the basement. Not a loud sound, not a crash or a voice, just breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, the kind you do when you've been running or lifting something, that wet, raspy inhale and exhale. It was coming from just beyond the basement door, down those stairs we couldn't see. And then the breathing paused, like whoever was down there had heard us moving. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. My entire body went rigid, and I could feel Ethan tense up beside me, finally understanding that something was very wrong. I didn't think. I just moved. I yanked Ethan toward the front door and he didn't resist this time, his candy bag forgotten on the floor. We stumbled out onto the porch, and I was pulling the door shut behind us when I heard footsteps, fast and heavy, coming up the basement stairs. Not running exactly, but moving with purpose. My hands fumbled with the doorknob, trying to pull it closed, but it stuck halfway like the frame was warped. Through the gap, I could see movement in the hallway, a shadow stretching across the wall from the basement doorway. Ethan was already at the bottom of the porch steps, and I abandoned the door, jumping down all 3 steps at once. We ran across the lawn, not bothering with the driveway, my shoes slipping on the wet grass. I didn't look back until we were under a streetlight 2 houses down, both of us gasping for air. When I finally turned around, the house looked exactly as it had before, dark and silent. The front door still hanging open. No one came out. No one appeared in the windows. It was like the whole thing had been swallowed back into the darkness. Ethan was shaking, his ninja sword crooked on his back, his face pale even in the orange glow of the streetlight. "Who was that?" he kept asking. "Who was down there?" I didn't have an answer. We stood there for maybe 2 minutes just watching the house, waiting for something to happen. Part of me wanted to call the cops right then, but what would I even say? We went into someone's house uninvited and heard breathing? That we saw muddy footprints and a recording phone? It sounded insane even in my own head, and I was terrified we'd get in trouble for trespassing. But I also couldn't shake the image of that spilled candy bowl, the phone still recording, the way those footprints led down to the basement like someone had been dragged. Finally, I grabbed Ethan's hand, something I hadn't done since he was little, and we walked quickly back to our house. Mom was on the porch waving at some kids leaving, and when she saw us, she smiled and asked how the hall was. I told her it was fine, that we were tired and going inside. She didn't notice that Ethan had left his candy behind, or that both of us looked like we'd seen something we couldn't explain. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to convince myself we'd overreacted, that maybe it was just someone doing yard work in their basement who got startled when they heard us upstairs. But the spilled candy, the recording phone, the muddy prints, they didn't fit that story. Around 2 in the morning, I crept downstairs and looked out the living room window toward the cul-de-sac. I couldn't see the house from our angle, but I could see the glow of police lights, red and blue, flashing against the trees. My heart started pounding all over again. I wanted to wake up my parents to tell them everything, but I was paralyzed by the fear of admitting we'd gone inside. Instead, I went back to bed and lay there staring at the ceiling until the sun came up. The next morning, Ethan came into my room before school, his eyes red like he hadn't slept either. He didn't say anything, just sat on the edge of my bed. Finally, I told him we needed to tell someone, that whatever we'd walked into was serious. He nodded, and we went downstairs together to find Dad reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Before I could say anything, Dad looked up and said, "Did you boys hear about the situation on Pinehurst last night?" My throat went dry. He folded the paper and continued. "Apparently there was a break-in at one of the houses. The couple that lives there came home from dinner and found someone had been inside. Police were there for hours." I asked which house, even though I already knew. "The one at the end, the Crawfords. Wife said she'd left a bowl of candy by the door before they left, and when they got back, it was knocked over, front door wide open. They think someone was trying to rob the place and got spooked when they came home." My mind raced. That meant we'd been in there while someone was still in the basement. The homeowners had come back while we were running away. The breathing we heard, the footsteps, that was the intruder. I felt sick. Dad kept talking, saying the police were asking neighbors if they saw anything suspicious, and I knew right then that we had to tell them. Ethan looked at me, waiting for me to make the decision. I took a breath and told Dad everything. The open door, the phone recording, the muddy prints, the breathing from the basement. He didn't yell or get mad. He just grabbed his keys and told us to get in the car. We drove to the police station, and I gave a statement to an officer who wrote everything down while nodding seriously. He said the phone recording was crucial evidence that whoever broke in might have accidentally activated it. They'd already dusted for prints and were checking security cameras from other houses. A few days later, they arrested someone, a guy from 2 towns over with a history of burglaries. He'd been hiding in the basement when the homeowners returned and fled through a back window after we left. The officer told my dad that if we hadn't spooked him by being in the house, he might have confronted the Crawfords directly when they came home, and things could have gone very differently. I don't know if that made me feel better or worse. We probably saved someone from getting hurt, but we also could have gotten hurt ourselves. Ethan and I don't really talk about it anymore, but every Halloween since then, when I see a house with no porch light, I keep walking. Some doors aren't meant to be opened even when they're already cracked. The best night of my life turned into the worst in less than an hour. My 13th birthday had come and gone that September of 2016, and with it came a new privilege, trick-or-treating without parents hovering behind us. Mom finally trusted me enough to go out with just my friends, as long as we stuck together and came home by 9. Our group had 5 people that year: me, Jason, my cousin Amanda, Brian from across the street, and Lucia, who lived 3 houses down. We'd spent the better part of October planning our route, circling houses on a hand-drawn map that gave out king-size candy bars, crossing out the ones that handed out pennies or toothbrushes. Jason was absolutely bouncing off the walls because his parents had been super controlling the year before, dragging him home at 7 while the rest of us kept going. They'd finally eased up and given him the same 9 o'clock curfew as everyone else. He kept going on and on about how we were going to clean out the entire neighborhood, stuff our pillowcases so full we'd need to make trips home to empty them. That feeling of independence, of being allowed to wander the streets on our own for the first time, made everything sharper and more exciting. None of us could have imagined that before the night ended, one of us would vanish, and the rest of us would carry that weight for the rest of our lives. We left around 6 in the evening, just as the sky shifted from orange to deep purple, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. The air had that perfect autumn chill where you could see your breath but didn't need a heavy jacket yet. I dressed as a zombie with torn jeans and a shredded shirt, fake blood smeared all over my face and hands that my mom had helped apply. Jason wore this glow-in-the-dark skeleton costume that looked sick once it got dark enough. Amanda went as a witch with a pointy hat that kept falling off. Brian chose some anime character I didn't recognize, and Lucia had on a vampire cape that dragged on the ground and kept getting caught on things. We attacked the first few blocks with pure energy, racing from house to house, our bags getting heavier by the minute. Everyone was hyped, laughing about whose costume was better, comparing candy hauls, trading the gross stuff nobody wanted. Around 7:30, we hit Oakwood Avenue, this long residential street with huge oak trees that created these creepy shadows under the streetlights. Brian threw out the idea that we should split up to hit more houses before time ran out. Amanda and Lucia wanted to tackle the left side of the street, and Brian decided to run back to a house we'd missed a couple blocks earlier. That left Jason and me to handle the right side of Oakwood, with everyone planning to meet up at the stop sign on the corner in 20 minutes. It seemed like the most normal suggestion in the world, the kind of call you make without thinking it through. Jason and I worked our way down the street, hitting every house with its porch light on. We were making good time, joking around about how Brian's costume looked like a rejected comic book character, rating each house's decorations on a scale of 1 to 10. Some people went all out with fake graveyards and motion sensor zombies, while others just stuck a plastic pumpkin on their doorstep and called it a day. Around the 5th or 6th house, Jason's pillowcase ripped at the seam from all the weight, and he had to double it up inside another bag he'd brought as backup. He was grinning like crazy, showing me this massive Snickers bar someone had just given him. We had maybe 3 more houses to go before we'd loop back to meet everyone else. That's when I noticed the fire truck parked on the side of the road, about halfway down the block. It wasn't running, no lights flashing or anything, just sitting there like someone had parked it and walked away. At first, I didn't think much of it because you see emergency vehicles around neighborhoods sometimes, especially on nights like that when there's so much activity. Jason noticed it too and made some joke about firefighters probably getting called out to rescue a cat from a tree or put out someone's decorations that caught fire. We kept moving, hit another house where the lady gave us homemade popcorn balls that looked questionable, and then Jason said he wanted to cross the street to check out this one house that had this insane haunted display with animatronic ghosts. I told him we should just finish our side first and then circle back, but he was already jogging across the road, his skeleton costume glowing bright in the darkness. I went to the next house on my side, rang the doorbell, waited for this old guy to drop candy in my bag, and when I turned around to see where Jason went, I saw him standing near the fire truck. There was a man next to him, tall, wearing full firefighter gear, the heavy coat and the helmet, everything. They were talking, and Jason was nodding, gesturing toward his bag like he was showing the guy his candy or something. I figured maybe it was someone's dad who was a firefighter, just hanging out and chatting with kids, being friendly. The whole interaction looked completely normal, harmless even. I didn't feel any alarm bells going off in my head. I actually thought it was kind of cool that Jason was talking to a real firefighter, I finished up the last 2 houses on my side, which took maybe 3 or 4 minutes tops, and when I looked back toward where Jason had been standing, he was gone. The fire truck was still there, but no Jason, no firefighter, just an empty street. At first, I figured he'd just moved on to another house, or maybe crossed back to my side of the street while I wasn't paying attention. I walked toward the stop sign where we were supposed to meet everyone, expecting to see him there already, probably bragging about some giant candy bar he'd scored. But when I got there, it was only Amanda and Lucia waiting, comparing their hauls and complaining about a house that gave out raisins. I asked if they'd seen Jason, and they both shook their heads. Brian showed up a minute later, out of breath from running, and he hadn't seen him either. We waited at that corner for another 10 minutes, then 15, joking at first that Jason was probably just trying to squeeze in a few more houses before meeting us. But as the minutes dragged on, the jokes stopped. Amanda suggested we walk back down Oakwood to look for him. So we did, all 4 of us retracing our steps, calling his name. We checked every yard, every side street, even knocked on a few doors asking if anyone had seen a kid in a skeleton costume. Nothing. The fire truck was gone too, which I only noticed when we got back to where I'd last seen Jason. The spot where it had been parked was completely empty. Not even tire marks or anything to prove it had been there at all. We searched for another 20 minutes before Amanda said we needed to tell our parents. None of us wanted to be the one to admit we'd lost Jason, but we didn't know what else to do. We walked back to my house because it was closest, and I remember my stomach twisting into knots as we climbed the porch steps. My mom took one look at our faces and knew something was wrong before I even opened my mouth. When I told her Jason hadn't shown up at the meeting spot and we couldn't find him anywhere, her expression shifted from concerned to seriously alarmed in about 2 seconds. She grabbed her phone and called Jason's mom while ushering all of us inside. I could hear Jason's mom's voice getting louder and more panicked through the phone, asking where he was last seen, what he was wearing, who he was with. My mom tried to keep her calm, but her own hands were trembling as she dialed 911. Within 15 minutes, there were police cars on our street, officers asking us questions, writing everything down in little notepads. I explained about the fire truck, about seeing Jason talking to the man in firefighter gear, and I watched the officers exchange these quick glances that made my chest feel tight. One of them asked me to describe exactly what the man looked like, but I couldn't give them much because of the helmet and the gear covering most of his face. All I remembered was that he was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, and his voice had sounded friendly when I'd heard him talking to Jason from across the street. The next few hours turned into this surreal blur of search parties and flashing lights. More police showed up, then volunteers from the neighborhood, everyone spreading out with flashlights, checking yards, garages, anywhere a kid might have wandered off to or gotten hurt. Jason's parents arrived at my house, his mom completely falling apart, his dad trying to hold it together, but you could see the terror in his eyes. They kept asking me the same questions the police had asked, wanting me to remember more details, anything that might help. I felt this crushing guilt building in my chest because I'd been right there, literally across the street from Jason when he was talking to that man, and I'd just assumed everything was fine. Why didn't I call out to him? Why didn't I cross the street to see what they were talking about? These questions hammered through my head over and over. My mom kept trying to reassure me that it wasn't my fault, that I had no way of knowing, but her words felt hollow. Amanda, Brian, and Lucia were all sitting in my living room looking shell-shocked, none of us really understanding how a normal night had spiraled into this nightmare. The police brought in dogs around midnight, and I watched from my window as they tracked Jason's scent down Oakwood Avenue, then lost it about a block past where I'd last seen him. The investigation kicked into high gear the next day. Detectives came to interview me again, this time with more specific questions about the fire truck and the man. They asked about the truck's number, any identifying marks, the color and condition of the firefighter gear. I did my best to remember, but everything had happened so fast and I hadn't been paying that much attention, because nothing seemed wrong at the time. They brought in a sketch artist who worked with me to create a composite, but since I'd barely seen the man's face, the drawing ended up pretty generic. What really broke the case open was the security footage. One of the houses on Oakwood had a camera system that covered their driveway and part of the street. The police got the footage and found the exact moment Jason approached the truck. You could see him walking up, see the man step out and start talking to him, see Jason pointing at his candy bag and laughing. Then the man gestured toward the back of the truck, and Jason walked around to look at something. The camera angle didn't capture what happened next, but 30 seconds later, the truck pulled away from the curb and drove off. Jason wasn't visible anywhere in the frame. When the detectives showed the footage to the fire department, trying to identify which station the truck belonged to, they discovered something that made everyone's skin prickle with dread. The truck had the right markings and looked legitimate, but the number on the side belonged to a truck that had been decommissioned months earlier. That discovery shifted everything. This wasn't some tragic accident or a kid who'd wandered off and gotten lost. Someone had deliberately posed as a firefighter, using gear and a vehicle that looked official enough to fool everyone, including me. The police started pulling records, cross-referencing anyone with access to old fire department equipment, checking former employees, anyone who might have had reason to own or steal a decommissioned truck. It took them 3 days to identify a suspect. His name was Vincent Carr, a firefighter who'd been suspended from a department 2 towns over for behavioral issues and inappropriate conduct. He'd been fighting the suspension, claiming it was unfair, and had been living in some rundown rental property while the appeals process dragged on. When detectives went through social media and public records, they found he'd purchased firefighter gear from an online auction site and had been seen driving a truck matching the description around his neighborhood. They got a warrant and showed up at his place on a Friday morning, nearly a week after Jason disappeared. Carr wasn't home, but they searched the property anyway and found Jason's skeleton costume stuffed in a trash bag in the garage, along with maps of our neighborhood with certain streets circled in red marker. The manhunt intensified after that. Carr's face was all over the news, Amber Alerts going out across 3 states, tips flooding in from people who thought they'd seen him. I couldn't stop watching the coverage, this sick compulsion to know what was happening, even though every update made me feel worse. My parents tried to limit my exposure to it, but I'd sneak my phone under my covers at night and read every article, every comment thread, torturing myself with what-ifs and possibilities. Jason's parents held a press conference begging for information, his mom barely able to speak through her tears, and watching that destroyed me all over again. School became unbearable because everyone knew I was the last person to see Jason before he vanished. Some kids asked invasive questions, others avoided me entirely like I carried some kind of curse. Amanda stopped coming to school altogether for 2 weeks. Brian's parents pulled him out and enrolled him somewhere else. Lucia's family moved away before the year ended. Then, 11 days after Jason disappeared, a jogger found his backpack in a drainage ditch about 5 miles from our neighborhood, out near the industrial park where all the warehouses were. The backpack was still full of candy, every piece accounted for, his name written in Sharpie on the inside flap. Police combed the entire area with dogs and search teams, but they didn't find anything else. No other evidence, no sign of Jason, nothing that explained why the backpack had been dumped there specifically. Vincent Carr was finally arrested 3 weeks later in a motel outside Cleveland, over 200 miles away. He'd been moving around, paying cash for rooms, avoiding cameras, basically acting exactly like someone with something to hide. When they brought him in for questioning, he refused to talk without a lawyer, and even then, he wouldn't say a word about Jason. The evidence against him was solid enough for charges. The costume in his garage, the truck that matched witness descriptions, security footage showing him in our neighborhood that night, his own lack of alibi. But without Jason, without a body or a confession, the case stalled in this agonizing limbo. The prosecutors worked with what they had, building a circumstantial case for kidnapping, but everyone knew it wasn't enough for the kind of justice Jason's family deserved. The trial happened about 1.5 years later, and I had to testify, had to sit in that courtroom and describe what I'd seen that night while Carr sat there in a suit, staring at nothing, showing zero emotion. The jury convicted him on multiple charges and he got 40 years, but he never admitted what he did with Jason. He never told anyone where to look, never showed a shred of remorse. Jason's parents were in court every single day, and when the verdict came down, they didn't even look relieved. How could they? Their son was still gone. The years since then have been strange. I'm in my early 20s now, graduated college, trying to build a normal life. But that night follows me everywhere. I can't go anywhere near Oakwood Avenue without feeling like I'm going to be sick. Every year when the end of October rolls around, I get this tight feeling in my chest that doesn't go away until November starts. I've been in therapy since I was 15, trying to work through the guilt, the constant replay of those moments when I could have done something different. Jason's case occasionally pops up on true crime shows or podcasts, and every time it does, I get messages from strangers asking for details, people who treat it like entertainment instead of the worst thing that ever happened to real people. His parents never stopped looking. They hired private investigators, followed up on every single tip no matter how far-fetched, kept his face on social media and missing person databases. About 6 months ago, there was a credible lead about remains found in a wooded area near where Carr used to live, and for a few awful days, everyone thought it might finally be closure. DNA testing ruled it out. So we're still here, still waiting, still hoping for an answer that might never come. I think about Jason all the time, wonder what kind of person he'd be now if that night had gone differently, if we'd just stayed together as a group like we were supposed to. That's the thing that haunts me most. How one simple decision, splitting up to cover more ground, to get more candy, cost someone their entire life. My mom stood in the doorway that October evening, arms crossed, giving me that look she always did when she was about to say no to something. I'd been begging for weeks to go trick-or-treating without her following me around like I was still in kindergarten. And honestly, I was starting to lose hope. But then she sighed, did that thing where she rubbed her temples and said fine, I could go with the neighborhood kids as long as I was home by 8:30. I practically jumped through the ceiling. 11 years old and finally getting some freedom felt like winning the lottery. She made me promise about 1,000 things, stuff about staying with the group and not talking to strangers, basic things I already knew. I remember nodding through it all, barely listening, just wanting to grab my costume and get out the door before she changed her mind. The group I went with was 6 kids total from our street in Riverside Heights, this quiet neighborhood in Oregon, where nothing interesting ever happened. There was Tommy Brennan, this 13-year-old who acted like he was too cool for all of us but came anyway, and then me and 4 other kids around my age. We had our route planned out for weeks, targeting all the houses that gave out full-size candy bars first, then hitting the streets with the best decorations. I dressed up as a zombie cheerleader, spent forever getting the fake blood just right on my face and uniform. My plastic pumpkin bucket was orange with this goofy jack-o'-lantern face, same one I'd been using since 1st grade. By 7 that evening, it was already filling up with Snickers and Reese's. All the good stuff. The air had that perfect fall smell, dead leaves and wood smoke, and every single house on our block had their porch lights blazing. I felt like I could do anything, like I was finally old enough to be part of the real world, instead of just watching it from behind my parents. Things started changing around 7:45. We were on Ashwood Drive, this street about 4 blocks from my house, when Sophie's dad pulled up in his pickup truck. She waved goodbye and climbed in, and I remember feeling a little pang of jealousy because her bucket was overflowing and mine was only half full. Then 20 minutes later, Tommy's older brother came to get him, and the Martinez twins said their mom wanted them home early. That left just me and Kevin Walsh, this kid from my math class who dressed up as a vampire with these ridiculous plastic fangs that kept falling out of his mouth. We kept going, hitting a few more houses, but I could tell Kevin was getting tired. His dad showed up around 8:15 in front of this house with a giant inflatable ghost in the yard. Kevin looked at me all apologetic and said he had to go, that his dad had work early in the morning. I told him it was fine, that I'd head home in a few minutes anyway. But I lied. My bucket was still only half full, and I'd promised myself I'd fill it to the top before going back. I kept walking alone down Ashwood, then turned onto Berkeley Road, checking my phone every few minutes. 8:20, 8:25. I had maybe 5 minutes before I needed to start heading back, but there were still houses with their lights on, still candy to collect. That's when I noticed the house at the end of Berkeley, number 847, sitting back from the street with this long driveway and overgrown hedges. I'd walked past it a million times going to the corner store or riding my bike to school. It was one of those houses that always looked the same. Paint peeling on the shutters, grass a little too long. Nothing special about it. But that night, something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was because every other house on the block was lit up like a carnival, and this one sat there in complete darkness. The porch light was off, the windows were black, and taped to the front door, I could just barely make out a white piece of paper that said, "No candy," in thick black marker. I should have kept walking. That's what I tell myself now, that I should have just turned around and headed home with my half-full bucket and called it a night. But I was 11 and stubborn, and annoyed that I'd wasted time going out alone when I could have gotten way more candy if the group had stayed together. So I walked up the driveway, my sneakers crunching on the gravel, telling myself I'd just knock once to be polite, to cover every house on my route like I'd planned. The no candy sign was right there at eye level when I reached the door, the tape yellowed and curling at the edges like it had been there for weeks. I raised my hand to knock anyway, one of those stupid defiant moments where you do something just because someone told you not to. But before my knuckles even touched the wood, I heard this sound from inside. A creaking sound, like old furniture shifting weight. Then the door moved, just an inch, swinging inward on its hinges without anyone pulling it. The smell hit me first, not like rotting food or garbage, but something stale and thick, like a room that hadn't had fresh air in months. I stood there in the doorway, my pumpkin bucket hanging from my wrist peering into the darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging from the gloom. A narrow hallway, a staircase going up on the left, and straight ahead, through an archway, I could see into what must have been the living room. That's where I saw her. A woman sitting on a couch, completely still, her body angled toward a television that was on but showing nothing except gray and white static. The glow from the screen lit up her face in this weird flickering way, and even from where I stood I could see she was older, maybe 60 or 70, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a floral housecoat, the kind my grandmother used to wear, and her hands rested on her lap like she'd just sat down to watch her shows and fallen asleep. I called out, "Hello?" My voice came out smaller than I meant it to, almost a whisper. The woman didn't move. The static from the TV was the only sound, that constant hissing white noise that makes your ears feel full. I thought maybe she was hard of hearing, that she hadn't noticed the door opening or me standing there. My mom had always taught me to be respectful to elderly people, to help them if they needed it, so I took a step inside. Just one step. The floorboards creaked under my weight, loud enough that I was sure she'd hear it and turn around, but she didn't. She just kept sitting there, facing that static screen, her silhouette perfectly still against the gray light. I took another step, then another, moving down the hallway toward the living room. My bucket bumped against my leg with each step, the candy inside shifting and rustling. When I reached the archway, I could see her more clearly now, see the way her housecoat had a coffee stain on the collar, see the veins visible on the backs of her hands. That's when I noticed her eyes. They were open, wide open actually, staring straight at the television screen with this blank, glassy look that made my chest tighten. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't even blinking. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few seconds watching her, waiting for her to blink or shift or do anything that would prove she was just zoned out watching TV. But nothing happened. Her chest wasn't moving up and down the way it should when someone breathes. Her fingers weren't twitching. She was just there, frozen, like a mannequin someone had posed on the couch. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask if she was okay, but the words got stuck in my throat. And that's when I saw the coat. A man's jacket, dark blue or maybe black in the dim light, hanging on the wooden chair beside the couch. It was dripping. Not a lot, but enough that I could see the small puddle forming on the hardwood floor beneath it, the fabric heavy and saturated like someone had just come in from a storm. But it hadn't rained that night. I remembered that clearly because I'd checked the weather obsessively all week, terrified that it would pour and ruin everything. The sky had been clear when I left my house, cold but dry, not a cloud anywhere. So why was that coat soaking wet? I stared at it, at the water dripping in this steady rhythm, plip, plip, plip onto the floor, and my brain started putting together things I didn't want it to put together. Someone else was in this house. Someone who'd just come in. Someone who'd hung up their wet coat and then what? Just left this woman sitting here like this? I took a step backward, my sneaker squeaking on the floor, and that tiny sound felt like a gunshot in the silence. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, louder than the static from the TV. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there right now and call someone. Call my mom, call the police, call anyone. I turned toward the hallway, ready to run, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from upstairs, right above my head. The ceiling creaked with each step, old wood groaning under weight, and I could track the movement as whoever it was walked across the second floor. They were heading toward the staircase, toward me, every muscle in my body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stand there clutching my stupid plastic pumpkin bucket and listening to those footsteps get closer. They reached the top of the stairs. I heard the first step creak as someone began descending, then the second step, the third. I could see the edge of the staircase from where I stood, could see the shadow stretching down the wall, growing longer with each step. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run out the front door that was still open behind me, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was like being in one of those nightmares where you try to run but your body won't listen. Then something broke through the paralysis. Survival instinct maybe, or just pure terror finally kicking my body into gear. I spun around and bolted for the door, my feet slipping on the hardwood floor before I found traction. The pumpkin bucket flew out of my hand, candy scattering everywhere, Snickers and Reese's bouncing across the floor like marbles. I didn't care. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, throwing myself through the open doorway and down the porch steps. I didn't look back. I just ran down that driveway, my zombie cheerleader costume ripping on a bush as I stumbled past it, fake blood smearing across my face as I wiped away tears I didn't even realize I was crying. When I hit the sidewalk, I kept running, past 3 houses, 4 houses, 5, until my lungs were burning and my legs felt like they were going to give out. Only then did I stop and turn around. The house sat there in the darkness, exactly like before. Door still open. No one following me. Just that black rectangle of an entrance and silence. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and called my mom. She answered on the first ring, already annoyed that I was cutting it close to 8:30. But when she heard my voice, all choked up and scared, her tone changed instantly. I couldn't get the words out right at first, kept stumbling over them, trying to explain about the house and the woman and the wet coat and the footsteps. She told me to stay where I was, that she was coming to get me right now, and I stood there under a streetlight shaking like a leaf until I saw our car coming down the street. When I got in, she took one look at my face and knew something was really wrong. I told her everything while she drove straight to the police station, didn't even go home first. The officer at the desk looked skeptical at first, probably thought I was some kid making up stories after watching too many scary movies on Halloween, but my mom was insistent. She demanded they check on the woman, said her daughter wouldn't make something like this up. 2 patrol cars went to the house that night. My mom and I waited at the station for what felt like forever, sitting in those uncomfortable plastic chairs while I kept replaying everything in my head. When the officers came back, their faces were serious in a way that made my stomach hurt. The woman's name was Gloria Hendricks. She was 73 years old, and lived alone after her husband passed away 5 years earlier. According to the officers, she died sometime that afternoon, probably a heart attack or stroke, just sitting there on her couch watching television. The medical examiner would confirm it later, but they were pretty sure she'd been gone for hours before I walked in. What scared me even more was what they found upstairs. Her nephew, Douglas Hendricks, had been staying with her for the past 2 weeks. The officers found him in the upstairs bathroom, passed out drunk in the bathtub, still wearing his work clothes that were soaked through, because he'd apparently tried to take a shower with all his clothes on and given up halfway through. That explained the wet coat downstairs and the footsteps I'd heard. The officers told us that Douglas had no idea his aunt had died. He'd come home from work around 6 that evening, already drunk, went straight upstairs without checking on her, and passed out in the tub. He never even noticed she was sitting there dead in the living room. When they woke him up and told him what happened, he completely broke down. They didn't charge him with anything because technically he hadn't done anything wrong, just failed to check on his elderly aunt when he came home too wasted to function. But the officers said if I hadn't gone into that house, if I hadn't called it in, Gloria might have sat there for days before anyone found her. Douglas was supposed to be taking care of her, but he was too deep in his own problems to notice hers. One of the officers, this woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun kind of like Gloria's, she knelt down in front of me and said, I did the right thing by calling for help, that I was very brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt sick and scared and guilty for some reason I couldn't explain. My mom drove us home in silence. When we pulled into our driveway, she turned off the car, but neither of us moved for a long time. Finally, she reached over and squeezed my hand and said that sometimes life puts us in situations we're not prepared for. Situations where we see things we're too young to understand. She said what I saw wasn't my fault, that I'd helped someone even though I didn't realize it at the time. But here's the thing that still messes me up when I think about it. If I'd gotten there 30 minutes earlier, if my friends hadn't left when they did, if I'd filled my bucket faster and gone home on time like I was supposed to, maybe I could have gotten help before Gloria died. Maybe she was still alive when I walked past that house earlier in the evening. Maybe she was sitting there having a heart attack, while I was 3 houses down collecting candy and laughing with my friends. I know that's not rational, that there was nothing I could have done, but that thought sits in my brain like a stone I can't shake loose. I never went trick-or-treating again after that night. Every year my parents would ask if I wanted to go, if I wanted to dress up and walk the neighborhood with friends, and every year I'd make up some excuse about being too old for it or having too much homework. The truth is, I couldn't walk down Berkeley Road anymore without seeing that open door, that flickering gray light from the television, Gloria sitting there with her eyes open and empty. The house got sold about 6 months later to a young couple with a baby. They painted it yellow and put in new windows and planted flowers in the front yard. It looks completely different now, cheerful and alive, but I still cross to the other side of the street when I have to walk past it. Some things change you in ways you can't undo. That night changed me. It taught me that terrible things can happen in the most ordinary places, that death doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It just sits quietly on a couch waiting to be found. And it taught me that sometimes doing the right thing, calling for help, trying to wake someone up, doesn't change anything except the fact that you were there to witness it. I'm 24 now, and I still think about Gloria Hendricks sitting in that dark house. Still wonder if she knew what was happening to her in those final moments. Still hope that wherever she is, someone finally answered her door. Halloween fell on a Saturday in 2022, and I remember thinking that made it perfect. No school the next day meant nobody had an excuse to bail early. I was a junior at Westfield High, and honestly, most people my age had already aged out of trick-or-treating. But my friends and I had this tradition where we'd dress up ironically, hit the rich neighborhoods, and see who could collect the most candy. Childish? Maybe. But free candy is free candy. And it beat sitting at home watching horror movies we'd all seen a dozen times. That year I went as a zombie office worker, complete with a tie and briefcase splattered with fake blood. My buddies Jake and Austin were with me for the first couple hours, but around 9:30 they started getting texts from people at a party across town. They wanted to head out, said we'd already hit most of the good houses anyway. I told them to go ahead. There were still a few streets I wanted to check out, ones we hadn't covered yet, and I figured I had until 11 before my parents would start blowing up my phone. The neighborhood I grew up in, Meadowbrook, sits on the north side of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where people leave their Christmas lights up until February and nobody bats an eye. The houses are a mix of colonials and split levels from the 70s, most with big front yards, and those old maple trees that turn the streets into tunnels of orange and red every October. Halloween always brought the neighborhood to life in this specific way. You'd see families you hadn't spotted in months, kids running in packs from house to house, parents trailing behind with flashlights and thermoses of coffee spiked with something stronger. But by the time Jake and Austin took off, things had started to wind down. Porch lights were clicking off one by one, and the groups of little kids in their store-bought costumes had mostly disappeared. I didn't mind, though. The quiet felt kind of nice after all the screaming and chaos earlier. I walked down Chestnut Lane with my pillowcase of candy slung over my shoulder, still hitting the houses that had their lights on, getting the usual comments from adults about how I was getting too old for this, but here's some Snickers anyway. That's when I first noticed him. I was coming down the steps of the Castellano house, unwrapping a Reese's cup, when I glanced across the street and saw a guy standing under a streetlight. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there with his hands in the pockets of this dark jacket. No costume, no candy bag, no kids with him. At first I figured he was waiting for someone, maybe a parent whose kid was taking forever at a house or something. But there was nobody else around. The street had emptied out while I was at the door, and it was just me and this guy on opposite sides of the road. He was maybe 40 feet away, far enough that I couldn't make out his face clearly, but close enough that I could tell he was looking in my direction. Not staring exactly, but aware. I felt this little ping in my chest, that weird instinct that tells you someone's paying attention to you. I finished the Reese's, crumpled the wrapper, and kept walking toward the next house with a light on. When I got to the porch and glanced back, the guy had moved. He was further down the street now, still on the opposite side, still just standing there. I rang the doorbell and waited, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. An older woman answered, dropped some fun-size Milky Ways in my bag, and I thanked her and headed back down to the sidewalk. The man was still there. He'd moved again, repositioned himself so he was directly across from where I was now. That's when my brain started doing that thing where it tries to rationalize something that doesn't make sense. Maybe he lived on this street and was just out enjoying the holiday. Maybe he was checking on decorations or waiting for someone who was running late. Maybe I was being paranoid because it was Halloween and I'd watched too many slasher films. But then I walked to the next house, 3 doors down, and when I came back out, he'd moved again. Same distance, same side of the street, just keeping pace with me. He wasn't following exactly, wasn't walking behind me or anything obvious like that. He was mirroring me. Every time I moved, he adjusted his position to stay across from where I was. My heart started beating faster, that deep thud you feel in your ears when adrenaline kicks in. I told myself I was overreacting, that there was a perfectly normal explanation, but my hands were gripping the pillowcase tighter, and I was suddenly very aware of how empty the street had become. I decided to test it. Instead of going to the next house in line, I crossed to the other side of the street, heading toward a place with inflatable decorations still lit up in the yard. If this guy was just randomly walking around, he'd stay where he was or move in some other direction. But if he was actually tracking me, he'd have to adjust. I kept my eyes down, pretending to check my phone, but I was watching him in my peripheral vision. Sure enough, as soon as I crossed, he started moving too. Not rushing, not making it obvious, just a casual stroll that happened to bring him back across the street to the side I'd just left. We'd basically swapped positions. My stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't coincidence anymore. This was deliberate. I went up to the house, rang the bell, and when a guy in a witch hat answered, I barely registered what candy he gave me. My focus was on the man across the street who had stopped near a parked minivan and was standing there like he had all the time in the world. When I came back down the steps, I made a split-second decision to head toward the main road where there'd be more lights, maybe more people. I walked faster now, not quite running but definitely moving with purpose. My sneakers made this rhythmic slap against the pavement, and I kept my breathing steady, trying not to let panic take over. The main road was only 2 blocks away, and there was a gas station on the corner that'd definitely still be open. I could go there, hang out inside for a bit, maybe call my parents to come get me even though I'd feel like an idiot explaining why. As I turned the corner onto Willow Court, I risked a glance back. The man was still there, but he'd stopped moving. He was just standing at the intersection, a dark shape under the streetlight watching me go. Relief flooded through me for about 3 seconds. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the shuffling, distant kind, but close. Deliberate. Someone walking at a steady pace behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to just keep walking, to not confirm what I already knew. But I couldn't help it. I looked back, and there he was. He'd crossed the street and was now following me directly, maybe 20 feet back. The casual pretense was gone. He wasn't trying to hide it anymore. My legs moved automatically, faster now, my pillowcase of candy bouncing against my hip. I thought about running, just full-on sprinting toward the main road, but some part of my brain worried that might trigger him to run too. As long as I was walking, he was walking. Maybe if I stayed calm, acted like I hadn't noticed, I could get somewhere safe before things escalated. The houses around me were mostly dark now, their porch lights off, Halloween officially over for their occupants. I thought about banging on someone's door, screaming for help. But what if nobody answered? What if it took too long and he caught up while I was standing there like an idiot? The gas station felt like the better option, somewhere public with cameras and people and bright fluorescent lights. I could see the glow of it in the distance, maybe 3 more minutes if I kept this pace. Behind me, the footsteps maintained their rhythm. Not faster, not slower, just there, constant. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, thinking I'd call someone, anyone, but my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The screen lit up showing 10:17. Still had 43 minutes until curfew. My parents wouldn't even be worried yet. I was about to dial Jake when I made the mistake of looking back again. The man had closed the distance. He was maybe 10 feet behind me now, close enough that I could see his face in the glow of a porch light I was passing. He looked completely ordinary. That's what freaked me out the most. No mask, no weapon visible, nothing that screamed danger except for the fact that he was following a teenager down a dark street. He had short brown hair, a weathered face that could have been anywhere from 35 to 50, and he was wearing jeans and that dark jacket, navy blue or black. His expression was blank, neutral, like he was just out for an evening walk and I happened to be in front of him. But his eyes were locked on me with this focused intensity that made my skin feel too tight. I shoved my phone back in my pocket and made a choice. I was going home. The gas station was too far, and I wasn't sure I could maintain this pace for 3 more blocks without breaking into a run. My house was closer, just 2 streets over. My parents might not be home yet. They usually didn't get back from their Saturday night dinners until 11. But at least I'd have walls and locks and I could call 911 if this guy tried to follow me inside. I turned right onto Grandview Drive, my street, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a jog. The footsteps behind me turned too. Of course they did. My house was the 7th one down, a tan split level with white shutters and a dogwood tree in the front yard that my dad was always threatening to cut down because it dropped too many leaves. As I got closer, my heart sank. Our porch light was on, the only one still lit on the entire block, which meant I'd forgotten to turn it off before I left. It also meant the house looked occupied when it wasn't. Every other house sat dark and buttoned up for the night, but mine glowed like a beacon. I glanced at the driveway as I approached. Empty. No Honda Accord, no Jeep Cherokee. My parents were definitely still out. The reality of being completely alone hit me like cold water. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys. That stupid Batman keychain Jake had given me last Christmas jangling as I pulled them out. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I could hear the footsteps still behind me, and I didn't need to look to know he was still there, still following. I made it to the front walk and practically ran up the 3 concrete steps to the porch. The key slid into the deadbolt on my second try, and I twisted it, hearing that beautiful click of the lock disengaging. I pushed the door open and stumbled inside, immediately turning to slam it shut behind me. That's when I saw him clearly for the first time in full light. He'd stopped at the corner of my property, right where the sidewalk met our front lawn, standing perfectly still under the streetlight. He was just watching, not approaching, not leaving, just standing there with his hands in his pockets like he had all the patience in the world. The porch light illuminated half his face, throwing the other half into shadow, and I could see that same blank expression, that focused stare aimed directly at my front door. I slammed the door shut, locked the deadbolt, then the chain, then the handle lock. 3 locks total. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short gasps, and moved to the window beside it. The curtain was already drawn, but I pulled back just the edge, just enough to peek out. He was still there, standing, waiting. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I tried to explain what was happening, but my words came out jumbled and panicked. A man followed me home. He's outside right now. I'm alone. Please send someone. She was calm, professional, asked for my address and told me officers were on the way. She stayed on the line with me, asking questions I barely heard. Was he armed? I don't know. Did he threaten you? Not verbally, but he followed me for blocks. What's he doing now? Just standing there. The whole time I was on the phone, I kept my eyes on that window, watching his shadow under the streetlight. He didn't move, didn't pace, didn't pull out a phone, didn't do anything. Just stood there like a statue, facing my house. 5 minutes passed, though it felt like an hour. The dispatcher kept talking to me, keeping me calm, and then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens. Distant at first, then growing louder as they approached. The man heard them too. I saw his head tilt slightly, listening, and then without any rush or panic, he simply turned and walked away. Not running, not hurrying, just a casual walk back the way he'd come, disappearing into the darkness between streetlights. 2 police cars pulled up less than a minute later, their lights painting my house in alternating red and blue. I unlocked the door and met the officers on the porch, and one of them immediately went to search the area while the other took my statement. I told him everything, described the man as best I could, explained the route we'd taken. They found nothing. No sign of him anywhere in the neighborhood. The officer was kind, took me seriously, didn't make me feel stupid or paranoid. He said they'd increase patrols in the area and asked if I wanted to file a formal report. I said yes. My parents came home about 20 minutes later, called back early by the dispatcher, and I'd never been so relieved to see them. They were scared, angry, hovering. My mom kept hugging me while my dad talked to the officers. The police stayed until almost midnight, checking all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. They never found the man. No neighbors had seen anything, no security cameras caught him, nothing. It was like he'd just vanished. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the memory of him standing there under that streetlight, just watching. Police never identified him, never got any leads. I finished high school, went to college, moved on with my life. But even now, years later, I still check behind me when I'm walking alone at night, and I never, ever trick or treat anymore. Me and my buddies had been planning the ultimate trick-or-treating vlog for weeks. We weren't little kids anymore, just grabbing candy and going home. No, we wanted to document everything, make it cinematic, blow up on TikTok with something actually cool. I'd gotten my driver's license in early September. 2 weeks after turning 16, which suddenly made me the guy with the car and the guy responsible for coordinating this whole operation. Aaron, Chris, Miguel, and me decided we were going full commitment on costumes too. I spent 3 hours working on this zombie surgeon look, complete with a chest wound I made using liquid latex and food coloring that looked disturbingly real. Aaron ordered this insane leather plague doctor mask online that made him look like he stepped out of a horror movie. Chris and Miguel went as killer clowns, except they made it genuinely unsettling instead of the usual party store garbage. The main thing, though, was the GoPros. We each strapped one to our chests, the same kind streamers use, because Aaron was convinced that if we captured everything from multiple angles and edited it right, we could actually go viral. The plan was simple: hit every street in Cedar Brook Estates before midnight, get reactions from homeowners, showcase the craziest decorations, and turn it into this epic Halloween special that would get us internet famous. October 31st, 2023 started out perfect. The weather was weird for Michigan, sitting at like 60 degrees even after the sun went down, so we didn't need jackets covering up our costumes. We started around 7 in the evening, right in that sweet spot where it was dark enough to feel like real Halloween, but early enough that families with little kids were still out. Our neighborhood goes absolutely insane for the holiday. People drop thousands on decorations, turning entire front yards into elaborate haunted graveyards with fog machines, animatronic witches, motion sensor zombies, the whole production. We hit the first 10 houses without anything particularly interesting happening. Just the standard compliments on our costumes and king-size candy bars getting tossed into our bags. Aaron kept up this running commentary for his camera, cracking jokes about which houses had the best setups, doing voiceovers like he was hosting some professional documentary. Around House 15, we got to this place on Buttonwood Drive that had the most elaborate decorations I'd seen all night. Full-size skeletons were climbing up the brick exterior. Orange spotlights illuminated every corner of the yard. And there was this massive plastic cauldron by the front door with dry ice creating this rolling fog effect. The guy who answered looked maybe mid-40s, regular suburban dad type, holding a big wooden bowl filled with premium chocolate bars. He got really enthusiastic about our costumes, especially the GoPros, saying he loved that teenagers still went all out for trick-or-treating instead of thinking they were too cool for it. We thanked him, grabbed our candy, and moved on to the next house without giving that interaction a second thought. Nothing about it seemed off. He was just another friendly neighbor participating in the holiday. We spent the next 4 hours hitting nearly every house in the neighborhood, our bags getting heavier with each stop. The footage we were capturing was actually turning out incredible. We got this one house where the owner had rigged up a fake electric chair that sparked when you walked past it. Another place where someone dressed as Michael Myers just stood completely still in the doorway until we turned to leave, then moved slightly to freak us out. Chris nearly dropped his entire bag of candy when that happened. By 11, our feet were killing us, and the streets had mostly cleared out, just a few stragglers heading home. We'd filled up 2 bags each, way more than we needed, but Aaron insisted we had enough content to make something actually good. The drive back to my place took maybe 10 minutes, all of us buzzing with adrenaline and already talking about how many views we'd get. My mom was still awake when we got home, sitting in the living room with her laptop, working on something for her job at the insurance company. She asked how the night went, told us to keep it down because my little sister was asleep, and said we could use the basement to go through the footage as long as we cleaned up after ourselves. The basement became our editing bay for the next 2 hours. We had 4 different camera angles from the same night, all this raw footage that needed to be synced up and cut together. Aaron was the best with editing software, so he took the lead, pulling all the files onto his laptop while the rest of us watched and gave input. We started from the beginning, watching ourselves leave my driveway, walking up to the first few houses. It was actually pretty cool seeing it all come together, these different perspectives of the same moments. Some houses looked way better on camera than they did in person, the lighting and fog machines creating this legit creepy atmosphere. We were maybe an hour into reviewing everything when Aaron pulled up the footage from Buttonwood Drive. That house with the elaborate decorations and the friendly guy. On screen, you could see all four of us approaching the door, the orange lights making our costumes look even better than I remembered. The guy opened the door right on cue, complimented our outfits, dropped chocolate bars into our bags, made that comment about loving teenagers who still trick or treat. Standard interaction, nothing weird. But then Aaron noticed something. After we turned and walked away, heading down the driveway toward the street, his GoPro kept recording. The camera had caught the doorbell, one of those Ring doorbell cameras, still lit up on the door frame. Aaron paused the video and rewound it. We'd all walked away laughing about something, our voices getting quieter as we moved toward the street, and the guy had closed his door. But the GoPro was still picking up audio. Faint, but there. At first it sounded like nothing, just that ambient noise you get on recordings, maybe wind or the fog machine still running. Aaron turned up the volume on his laptop and we all leaned in closer. That's when we heard it. Sound coming from inside the house, muffled but distinct enough to make us go quiet. It was crying. Not like sad movie crying, but the kind of desperate, choked sobs that sound like someone's trying really hard to stay silent and failing. The sound lasted maybe 5 seconds before we heard a man's voice, low and harsh, whisper something that made my chest tighten. Quiet, quiet. The words came through distorted, like he was speaking through a door or from another room, but you could hear the edge in his tone. Threatening. Then nothing. The audio went back to normal street sounds, our voices in the distance talking about the next house. Aaron looked at me, then at Chris and Miguel, and nobody said anything for a solid 10 seconds. Chris was the first to break the silence, suggesting maybe it was a TV show or a movie playing inside. That made sense, right? People leave TVs on during trick-or-treating all the time. We replayed it 4 more times, each of us trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. But the more we listened, the worse it sounded. The crying had this raw quality to it, not performed or acted. And that voice, the way he said quiet twice like that, it had this urgency that didn't match a television program. Miguel suggested maybe it was part of their Halloween setup, like a speaker playing creepy sounds to mess with people. Some houses do elaborate stuff like that, but none of us had seen any speakers near the door, and besides, why would those sounds be playing after we'd already left? Aaron scrubbed through more of the footage, checking if any other houses had weird audio, but everything else was completely normal. Just our voices, doorbells ringing, people saying Happy Halloween, the usual neighborhood ambiance. It was only that one house on Buttonwood Drive, only that specific moment right after the guy closed the door. I kept thinking about how normal he'd seemed, how genuinely friendly his whole vibe was. The decorations, the expensive candy, that note he had taped to his mailbox that said, Happy Halloween from the Graysons, with a little ghost drawn on it. Everything about that house screamed regular suburban family. But that audio didn't match any of it. We sat there in my basement, the timestamp on the video frozen at the exact moment you could see the Ring doorbell camera on his door frame. And this sick feeling started building in my stomach that wouldn't go away. By 1 in the morning, we'd exhausted every rational explanation we could think of. Chris was still pushing the TV theory, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Aaron suggested we just delete that part of the footage and use everything else for the vlog. Pretend we never heard it. Miguel hadn't said much for the past 20 minutes, just sitting there staring at the paused video with this look on his face I couldn't read. I wanted to agree with Aaron, just forget about it and move on, but something kept stopping me. That crying sounded too real. That voice sounded too threatening. What if someone actually needed help and we just ignored it because we didn't want to deal with something complicated? I told them I was going to show my mom. They all looked at me like I was crazy, saying she'd probably just tell us we were being paranoid, that we'd get in trouble for wasting people's time, that it was probably nothing anyway. But I couldn't shake it. I went upstairs and found my mom still in the living room, now watching some crime documentary with her reading glasses on. When I told her we'd found something strange in our footage and asked if she could listen to it, she gave me this tired look like she expected me to show her a funny TikTok or something. She followed me down to the basement anyway, and Erin played the clip for her without any build-up or explanation. She listened to it once, asked Erin to play it again, then a third time with the volume even higher. The expression on her face changed completely. She asked which house it was, and when I told her Buttonwood Drive, the one with all the skeleton decorations, she got this focused look I'd only seen a handful of times before. My mom works in insurance claims, deals with investigations and police reports pretty regularly for her job, so she's not the type to overreact or jump to conclusions. But she wasn't dismissing this. She asked Erin to send her the video file, then told all of us to stay in the basement while she made a phone call upstairs. We could hear her voice through the ceiling, muffled but intense, talking to someone for maybe 15 minutes. When she came back down, she had her phone in her hand and this serious expression that made my heart start pounding. She said she'd called a friend of hers who works for the local police department, explained the situation, and sent him the audio clip. He was taking it seriously enough that he'd already contacted the officers on duty that night. She told us we did the right thing by showing her that we shouldn't post any of this footage online, and that we might need to talk to police in the next day or two. The way she said it made the whole thing feel suddenly real, in a way it hadn't before. Like we'd stumbled into something that was way bigger than just a weird noise on a recording. None of us slept that night. Erin, Chris, and Miguel crashed at my place because it was already past 2 in the morning and nobody wanted to go home yet. We just sat around refreshing our phones, checking local news sites, waiting for something to happen. Nothing came up. By 6 in the morning, when the sun started coming up and my little sister woke up for Saturday morning cartoons, we still hadn't heard anything. My mom made us breakfast and told us to try to act normal, that these things take time. But how were we supposed to act normal? I kept picturing that house, those decorations, that friendly guy who'd complimented our costumes. Kept hearing that crying and that harsh whisper saying "quiet, quiet" over and over in my head. Around 9, my mom got a phone call. She stepped into the kitchen to take it and we all went silent trying to listen. When she came back into the living room, her face had gone pale. She sat down on the couch and told us that police had gone to the house on Buttonwood Drive early that morning with a welfare check. What they found there made my entire body go cold in a way I'd never experienced before. The man who'd answered the door for us, the one with the friendly smile and the bowl of chocolate bars, had a woman locked in his basement. She'd been missing from a town 40 minutes away for 3 weeks. The details came out slowly over the next few days, pieced together from news reports and what my mom's police contact was willing to share. The woman's name was Nicole Hartman, 26 years old, a nurse who disappeared on her way home from a night shift in early October. Her family had been searching for her, posting flyers, organizing search parties, doing everything they could to find her. The man, Gregory Grayson, had apparently seen her at a gas station, followed her to a parking lot and taken her at gunpoint. He'd kept her in a reinforced room in his basement for 22 days. The night we showed up at his door, she'd heard voices outside and tried to cry out for help, which is what Erin's GoPro had picked up. Grayson had rushed down to silence her right after closing the door on us. If we hadn't been wearing those cameras, if Erin hadn't decided to review the footage, if we'd just assumed it was nothing and moved on, she'd probably still be there. The police told my mom that the room he'd built was soundproofed well enough that neighbors had never heard anything. The only reason we caught it was because his Ring doorbell mic was sensitive enough to pick up the sound during that brief moment when she tried to scream, and our GoPro happened to be recording at the exact right angle to capture the audio feed. The timing was pure chance, this horrible coincidence that ended up saving her life. The weeks after that were surreal. News outlets wanted to interview us, but my mom shut that down immediately, saying we were minors and didn't need that kind of attention. We had to give official statements to detectives, walking them through the entire night, explaining how the GoPros worked, why we were recording everything. They took Erin's camera as evidence, along with all the footage from that night. The vlog we'd planned never happened. None of us wanted to touch that content anymore, and honestly, The thought of editing together a fun Halloween video felt disgusting after what we'd learned. School was weird too. Word got around fast in our town, and suddenly everyone knew we were the kids who'd accidentally uncovered a kidnapping. Some people treated us like heroes. Others just stared at us in the hallways like we were fascinating specimens. I hated both reactions equally. Aaron stopped talking about TikTok fame and took down most of his social media. Chris and Miguel stayed close, but we didn't really talk about that night unless we had to. The thing nobody tells you about something like this is how it sticks with you in these random, unexpected ways. I couldn't watch horror movies anymore without feeling sick. Couldn't see Ring doorbells without my chest getting tight. Every time someone seemed a little too friendly or a little too normal, I'd wonder what was actually going on behind their front door. About 6 months later, we got word that Nicole Hartman wanted to meet us. My mom set it up through her police contact, made sure it was done properly with counselors present and everything. We met her at a coffee shop in a town over, neutral territory where she wouldn't run into people who knew her. She looked different from her missing person photos, thinner and with shorter hair, but her eyes were what got me. She had this intensity to her that made me understand she'd been through something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. She thanked us, not in a dramatic way, but quietly and genuinely. Said she'd heard our voices that night through the walls, heard us laughing and talking about our costumes, and for a brief moment thought maybe someone would notice something was wrong. When she heard us leaving, she'd made the choice to risk crying out, knowing he might hurt her worse for it, but thinking it might be her only chance. She told us that choice saved her life, but it was our choice to not ignore what we'd heard that actually got her out. We didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to someone whose nightmare you accidentally stumbled into? She didn't stay long, said she just needed us to know that we'd done something that mattered, that we shouldn't feel guilty or scared about what happened. I think she could tell we'd been carrying this weight around, and she wanted to lift some of it off us. After she left, the four of us just sat there for a while, not really talking, just processing everything. It didn't fix what we'd been feeling, didn't make the whole thing suddenly okay, but it helped. Gregory Grayson got 40 years, and Nicole moved to a different state to start over. We're seniors now, almost done with high school, and we still don't really talk about that Halloween. But sometimes when I see those true crime shows my mom watches, or when October rolls around and people start putting up decorations, I think about how close we came to just dismissing what we heard. How easy it would have been to call it nothing and move on. That's the part that still gets me. It was supposed to be one of those harmless Halloween nights that parents half enjoy for the nostalgia and half endure for the sugar chaos. My two kids, Lily and Ben, were bouncing in the back seat, their costumes already crumpled from the drive. We had heard through one of Lily's classmates that the houses over in Briarwood Circle were giving out the good stuff, the full-sized candy bars, not the tiny ones you get everywhere else. I figured it would be worth the drive, a fun detour before heading home. The neighborhood looked like something out of a magazine. Tall oaks, trimmed lawns, and houses glowing with string lights and pumpkins on every porch. We turned onto the cul-de-sac, and it really did feel like a small carnival. Kids in every direction, parents chatting at the curb, porch lights gleaming one after another. Every house but one. On the far end sat a two-story home, darker than the rest. No lights, no decorations, nothing but a faint blue flicker from inside, like the glow of a television left on. The front door was slightly open, just enough to notice from the street. I remember thinking maybe the owners had stepped out for a minute or just ran out of candy. I told the kids to skip it, but Ben was fixated on that house. He said he saw movement inside, a shadow by the stairs. He was only 7, and full of that fearless curiosity that makes you both proud and terrified as a parent. Lily, who was 9 and already in that know-it-all stage, laughed and said Ben was imagining things. They argued for a bit, and before I could finish telling them to move along, Lily said she'd prove it was nothing. She grabbed her plastic pumpkin bucket and started walking toward the house. I remember how her cape trailed behind her, brushing against the sidewalk, the sound of it oddly loud against all the laughter and chatter around us. I stayed by the car, not wanting to make a scene by yelling, figuring she'd knock, get no answer, and come right back. But she didn't. She stepped onto the porch, hesitated, and looked back at me once. Then she pushed the door a little wider. That's when the faint sound of a TV came clearer. Static and muffled voices, like an old news broadcast playing on loop. The air felt strangely still around that spot, as if the rest of the street had gone quieter. I saw her glance over her shoulder toward the living room inside. Then her small hand disappeared behind the doorframe. A second later, Ben followed her halfway up the path before I caught up and told him to stop. I called Lily's name, but before she could answer, I heard her scream. I ran up the path so fast I nearly tripped over Ben's candy bucket. The door was wide open now, the living room lit only by the glow of a television showing nothing but gray fuzz. The sound filled the air in this hollow way, like it had been playing for hours. I shouted for Lily again and moved deeper into the house, my voice echoing strangely. That was when I saw movement. Two small figures crouched under a dining table, their faces streaked with tears. Lily and Ben were both shaking, clutching each other. They wouldn't speak at first, just kept pointing toward the kitchen. I told them to stay put and stepped closer to where they were pointing. The smell hit me before I saw anything. Metallic, thick, and wrong. In the kitchen, a man sat tied to a chair, duct tape across his mouth. He was alive, barely, his eyes wide and darting toward me, pleading. I froze for a second that felt much longer than it probably was, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The light from the refrigerator spilled across the tile, showing scuff marks on the floor, and one of the back doors was swinging slightly, as if someone had just gone through it. I ran back to the kids, grabbed them both, and rushed out the front door, yelling for someone to call the police. A couple of parents nearby turned, confused at first, thinking maybe it was just some Halloween prank. When they saw the look on my face, they realized it wasn't. Within minutes, the cul-de-sac that had been buzzing with laughter fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of sirens getting closer. I tried to keep the kids calm, but Lily wouldn't stop repeating. He wasn't alone. Someone else was there. Her voice had this hollow, terrified tone that didn't sound like her at all. The police arrived fast. They told us to stay by the car while they cleared the house. Watching them move inside with their flashlights felt unreal, like I was outside my own life. I remember one of the officers calling out that the back door was open, another saying the ropes were fresh. Whoever did that had left minutes before we showed up. They led the kids into an ambulance to keep them warm, and one officer asked me questions I could barely process. My focus kept drifting back to that house, the one with no lights, sitting quietly at the end of the street as if nothing had ever happened there. Later that night, after giving our statements, an officer walked me to the house once more. The street was empty by then, candy wrappers and glow sticks scattered along the pavement, porch lights flicking off one by one. From the driveway, I could see through the open doorway. The TV had been turned off, and the silence inside felt heavier than before. The officer told me the homeowner's name was Mr. Dillard, a retired teacher who lived alone. He had apparently answered the door to what he thought were trick-or-treaters, and someone forced their way in. The rest, he said quietly, was just bad timing. For weeks afterward, Lily and Ben would wake up crying, saying they heard footsteps in their room or whispers near the window. We changed the locks, added cameras, did everything the police suggested, but the fear stuck to them like dust that never fully clears. One afternoon, I got a call from the detective assigned to the case. They'd found fingerprints in the kitchen, but none matched anyone in their database. Whoever it was had planned everything, down to the timing with the trick-or-treat crowds. They had used the laughter and noise outside as cover to move unseen. The house was sold months later. I drove past it once, against my better judgment. The new owners had painted it pale yellow, fixed the porch light, and planted flowers by the walkway. But something about it still looked wrong. Not haunted in a ghost story way, just violated, like the walls had seen too much. I parked for a minute, watching that porch where Lily had stood, her little cape fluttering. I imagined what would have happened if we'd arrived just a few minutes earlier, or later. Even now, I avoid cul-de-sacs. Halloween still comes every year, of course, but we keep it small. Our neighborhood, a few houses, nothing fancy. The kids are older and pretend not to remember much, but I know they do. Sometimes when a TV flickers through a window as we drive by, Lily glances away. I do too. Because I can't help but think that somewhere out there, whoever was in that house that night is still walking among all the noise and costumes, just waiting for another dark porch and another open door. It had been one of those autumn nights when the air felt sharp enough to taste. My friends and I had been moving from house to house, laughing through our masks, trading chocolate bars under the streetlights. We had planned this route for weeks, but somewhere between the last block and the park, I lost sight of them. Their voices faded into a mix of distant laughter and rustling leaves. I stood there for a moment, clutching my plastic pumpkin full of candy, trying to decide which way they had gone. Every direction looked the same, rows of houses with glowing porches and carved pumpkins flickering in the dark. I figured they had probably cut across the neighborhood toward the main street, so I decided to take a shortcut through the narrow alley that ran behind the houses. It was quiet there, too quiet maybe, but I told myself it would save time. The fences on both sides were tall, and the smell of damp leaves mixed with the faint scent of garbage. My sneakers brushed against the gravel as I walked, the sound strangely loud in the stillness. My costume, a witch dress my mom had made, kept catching on the candy bag as I shifted it from one hand to the other. Halfway through, I noticed how dark it was. The houses on either side had their lights facing the front yards, leaving the alley hidden in shadows. The only sound was the faint drag of my candy bag against my leg. I thought about using my phone's flashlight, but when I pulled it from my pocket, the screen was black. Dead. I sighed, more annoyed than scared, and kept going, quickening my steps. The air seemed colder the farther I went, like the night was thickening around me. That was when I heard it, a soft crunch behind me, the unmistakable sound of someone stepping on gravel. I turned, expecting to see one of my friends playing a prank. Nothing. Just a row of fences and the faint shimmer of moonlight on a metal trash bin. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray cat, but my heart was already thudding a little faster. Then a voice drifted through the quiet, low and steady, almost gentle. "Hey, you dropped something." I took a slow step backward, scanning the fences, expecting movement or a glint of fabric, but the alley stayed still. The only thing moving was a loose strip of paper fluttering against one of the trash bins. My chest felt heavy, and I tried to convince myself someone was just teasing from the yard, maybe an older kid trying to scare people. Still, something about the voice didn't sound playful. It was calm in a way that made no sense. I turned again and walked faster, the gravel crunching louder under my sneakers. That sound came again, soft but perfectly timed with mine. I started jogging, clutching the candy bag so tightly the plastic handle bit into my palm. Every time I sped up, the steps behind me matched exactly, not closer, not farther, just echoing me. My mind was racing through excuses. Maybe it was my own echo bouncing between the fences. Maybe the sound carried weird through the alley. I told myself to breathe, just make it to the end, and the whole thing would look ridiculous in daylight. But the end still looked far, and the dark stretched on like it was never going to open back to the street. A sharp clang made me stop. One of the trash bins had toppled behind me, rolling until it hit a fence. The lid spun, making a hollow ringing sound that died out slow. I didn't remember bumping into it. I didn't even think I was close enough. That was when I caught sight of something. Just a flicker between the slats of a fence. A darker shape moving behind the gaps, like someone was walking along the opposite side, keeping pace with me. I couldn't see a face, only the outline, tall and motionless each time I stopped. My breath felt too loud, echoing against the wooden walls around me. I didn't dare shout. Every instinct told me that making noise would make it worse. Instead, I broke into a full run, the candy spilling from the pumpkin as I held it against me. My legs burned and the end of the alley finally came into view, a faint square of streetlight. Just before I reached it, I heard that voice again, closer this time, clear as if someone was leaning right beside my ear. "You really should not have come this way." I reached the end of the alley and burst out onto a quiet street lined with houses that all looked the same. Every porch light seemed too far away. My chest hurt from running, and I turned to look back. At first, nothing moved. Then a shadow slid into view at the far end, tall and still, just standing there between the fences. I couldn't make out details, just the outline, head slightly tilted, hands hanging at its sides. For a second, it felt like the world had gone silent, the way it does before a storm. Then, a small crunch of gravel came again, like it had taken a single step forward. I ran to the nearest house and pounded on the door, yelling for help. The sound of my fist on the wood echoed through the street, but no one came. Porch lights flickered on across the road, yet this door stayed dark. I shouted again, my voice cracking. That was when a light finally came on inside, and I saw the curtain move. An older woman opened the door halfway, eyes wide, like she was scared before she even heard me speak. I begged her to let me in, explaining that someone was following me, that I didn't know where my friends had gone. She hesitated just a second, then opened the door enough for me to squeeze through. I turned one last time before stepping inside, and the shadow was still there at the end of the alley, not moving, not walking away, just watching. The woman slammed the door and locked it 3 times. She told me her name was Eleanor and that she had already called the police before even opening the door because she had heard footsteps outside her fence for the last 10 minutes. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there on her hallway rug, trying to steady my breathing while she made tea like this sort of thing happened all the time. When the police arrived, they searched the alley and the backyards nearby. They didn't find anyone. One of the officers said it was probably a teenager in a costume playing a prank, but Eleanor shook her head and said the footsteps had started before any trick-or-treaters passed by. The officer smiled politely, told us to lock the doors, and left. I never told my parents the full story, just that I got lost and a kind woman helped me. But I still remember that figure, motionless under the streetlight. It never chased me. It didn't have to. After that night, I stopped using shortcuts. Even months later, I found myself crossing streets just to avoid narrow spaces between buildings. My friends teased me for being jumpy, but I could not explain the kind of silence that had filled that alley. It was not like hearing something strange. It was more like the world had paused around me. I tried convincing myself it was some older kid in a mask, yet part of me never believed it. The way that shadow had stood, perfectly still, like it did not need to move to be dangerous, that stayed with me. Eleanor kept in touch for a while after the incident. She told my mom she would walk with me to school if I ever felt uneasy. A few weeks later, I heard from her again. She called to say someone had tried her back gate late one night. When the police came, they found only a small pile of candy wrappers and a single black glove near her fence. They told her it was probably nothing. She said she kept her windows closed after that. I did too. Years passed and I thought about that night less and less. But one Halloween, while handing out candy at my parents' place, I noticed something strange. A man lingered across the street, too far to see clearly. He never came closer, just stood under the same kind of streetlight that had lit that alley years ago. Kids walked past him laughing, and he never moved. When I blinked, he was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but I stayed inside after that. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and I catch the sound of gravel shifting outside, my mind goes straight back to that night. I keep telling myself it's just the wind or a raccoon, but deep down, I know that voice was real. I never saw his face, but I remember every word, soft and steady, like he was right behind me again. "You really should not have come this way." When I think about that night, I can still smell the mix of damp leaves and pumpkin candles. I lived on a quiet street where every kid knew every porch light that meant candy. We were a small group, me, Jason, and 2 others from the same block, and we had been planning our route for weeks. I remember my mom fussing over my costume, making sure the fake blood on my sleeve didn't stain the carpet. It felt like the kind of Halloween you wait all year for. Cool air, glowing decorations, parents chatting by mailboxes. We were too old to be walking with adults, too young to realize how fragile that kind of safety really is. Jason was the one who always took the lead, carrying a flashlight even when there were street lamps. He had this loud laugh that echoed down the sidewalk, the kind that made other kids turn around. That night he was dressed as a pirate, with an eye patch that kept slipping and a plastic sword that wouldn't stay in its belt loop. We joked that he'd trip over it before we got home. He didn't like being told to slow down, though. Said the faster we went, the more candy we'd get before the other kids hit the good houses. We had been walking for maybe an hour when we decided to split up. 2 of us turned toward Maple Hollow, and Jason said he wanted to check out the houses past the fire station. He waved like he'd see us in 10 minutes, his bag already bulging with candy. None of us argued. It was normal to separate for a bit and meet back at the park. I remember the crunch of leaves underfoot, the way the fog started to drift in from the open fields, swallowing the glow from the streetlights. It felt like the town was folding in on itself. The next time anyone saw Jason, he was talking to a man standing beside a red truck near the corner of Birch Lane. That's what one of the younger kids said later. The man was dressed like a firefighter, with reflective stripes catching the light. Jason had leaned against the truck, eating from his candy bag like he was just chatting. Nobody thought anything of it at the time. Why would they? The guy looked official, the truck looked real, and Halloween makes everything seem a little make-believe anyway. We regrouped at the park around 9. The swings creaked in the wind, candy wrappers stuck to the damp grass, and Jason's flashlight wasn't among the ones flickering in the dark. At first, we joked that he'd probably gone home early to trade candy with his sister. But when I passed his house on my way back, the porch light was still on, and his mom was standing out front, calling his name down the street. She looked worried in that quiet way parents do when they're still pretending everything's fine. I remember how her voice carried through the cold air, echoing off the houses. The police came fast that night. Flashlights swept through yards, car doors slammed, and they started asking questions none of us knew how to answer. They showed us a photo later, grainy, pulled from someone's security camera. It showed the red truck parked under a flickering streetlight, Jason standing nearby, and the man beside him wearing a real turnout coat. The patch on his sleeve was visible even in the blurry frame. That detail changed everything. It wasn't just a costume. The man turned out to be a firefighter who had been suspended months earlier. He lived 2 towns away, in a rundown duplex near the river. The police searched his place, but he was gone. They found uniforms, maps, and a collection of Halloween masks in a box by his bed. It didn't make sense. Why would someone like that come here, to our small neighborhood on that night? For weeks afterward, people left porch lights off and kept their kids inside after sunset. The decorations came down early and nobody said Jason's name out loud anymore. A week later, a runner found Jason's backpack in a ditch along the highway. It was soaked from the rain but still zipped shut, candy inside untouched. The wrappers were dry, like someone had packed them carefully before dropping the bag there. The sight of that bag in the news photo did something to me. It made everything real in a way I had been avoiding. I stopped walking past the fire station on my way to school. The sound of sirens started making my chest tighten. It's strange how one ordinary night can take every safe place and make it feel different forever. Months went by, and the town started pretending life was normal again. Streetlights got fixed, the fire station repainted its doors, and new families moved in like nothing had ever happened. But for those of us who were there, it never really left. I still remember the police car that parked on our street every evening for weeks, engine idling, officers waiting for any sign that the man might return. Nobody ever saw him again, but I think most of us kept expecting to. It felt like unfinished business, Like the story had paused, not ended. One night, about a year later, I was cleaning out the attic with my dad when I found one of Jason's old baseball caps. He used to leave stuff at our place all the time. The cap had a faint smell of smoke even after all that time. My dad said it was probably from storage, but the scent reminded me of something else. The way the air had smelled that Halloween night near the fire station. Heavy, chemical, like something had been burned that shouldn't have been. I did not say anything to him, but I kept that cap hidden in my room for years. Every October, the local paper runs a short piece about missing children, and Jason's name still shows up. His mom moved away after the second anniversary. Some say she visits the site where the backpack was found every Halloween, leaving a small pumpkin with a candle inside. A few of us from the old neighborhood meet at the park sometimes, the same one where we waited for him that night. We don't talk much when we're there. There's nothing new to say. Even now, when I see a fire truck driving by with its lights flashing, I feel that same cold awareness, like the world can change without warning. One man, one wrong trust, and a kid who just wanted more candy. It doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud, but for everyone who lived on that street, Halloween stopped being a holiday that year. It became the night Jason never made it home. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The ad on Craigslist seemed perfect for someone drowning in student loans like me. $400 a month for a room in a house near campus, utilities included, with 3 other roommates to split the common areas. I'd just turned 23 that April, and after burning through most of my savings on textbooks and ramen, this place felt like a miracle. The landlord, Walter Garrison, met me at the front door on move-in day with a clipboard and a grin that stretched too wide across his face. He walked me through the house, pointing out the thermostat I shouldn't touch, the dishwasher that only worked on the light cycle, and the basement door at the end of the hallway. "Storage down there," he said, jangling his keys. "Each tenant gets a section, but that back room stays locked. Just old tools and equipment from when my father owned the place." I didn't think much about it those first few weeks. Between my nursing program clinicals and my part-time job at the campus bookstore, I barely had time to sleep, let alone worry about locked doors and basements. My roommates were decent enough people who kept to themselves. There was Bradley, an engineering student who lived on energy drinks and barely left his room. Natalie, who worked nights at a call center and slept during the day. And Jerome, who was finishing his MBA and spent most weekends at his girlfriend's place. We crossed paths in the kitchen occasionally, nodded politely, and went about our lives. The house had that weird quality old rentals have, where every floorboard announces your presence, and the walls seem too thin for privacy, but somehow you still feel alone. My room sat directly above the basement, second door on the right from the stairs, with a window that faced the neighbor's fence, and let in exactly 45 minutes of sunlight each afternoon. The coughing started on a Monday night in early October. I remember because I'd just submitted a huge pharmacology paper, and was finally allowing myself 8 hours of sleep for the first time in weeks. Around 2 in the morning, this dry, rasping sound pulled me from a dream about missing an exam. At first, I thought it was Bradley down the hall, maybe catching a cold from all those late nights. But as I lay there in the dark, tracking the sound, I realized it was coming from below. Not just below, but directly beneath my bed. The cough had a muffled quality to it, like someone trying to suppress the noise by covering their mouth with fabric or their arm. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, these horrible wheezing bursts that made my chest hurt just listening to them, and then nothing. Complete silence except for the house settling and Natalie's alarm clock going off down the hall for her 3 a.m. shift. The next morning, I caught Walter in the driveway as he was leaving after fixing the garage door. "Hey, quick question," I said, trying to sound casual while holding my coffee mug like a shield between us. "Is there any way someone could be in the basement at night? I heard some weird noises." He barely glanced up from his phone, already walking toward his truck, a beat-up Ford with a cracked windshield and bumper stickers from 3 different political campaigns. "Probably the water heater," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. "Thing's older than you are, makes all kinds of racket when it kicks on. Had it checked last month, completely safe, just noisy." He pulled out before I could mention that water heaters don't usually cough, and I stood there in my pajama pants and oversized sweatshirt, feeling stupid for even asking. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I started to convince myself that maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or that sound travels weird in old houses, or that Bradley really did have a cold, and the acoustics just made it seem like it came from below. But that Friday, around midnight, the coughing returned. This time it went on for almost 5 minutes, these wet, desperate sounds that made me think of my grandfather in his last days at the hospice where I'd done my first clinical rotation. I grabbed my phone and recorded it, pressing the device against the floor to catch every wheeze and gasp. When I played it back with headphones, I could hear something else between the coughs, a rustling, like papers or plastic bags being moved around, and what might have been the squeak of old mattress springs. I sent the recording to Jerome since he was the only roommate I'd really talked to, and he responded immediately, even though it was past midnight. "That's definitely not the water heater. We should check it out." Jerome met me in the hallway 5 minutes later, holding a flashlight he'd grabbed from his car and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. We crept down to the basement like teenagers sneaking out after curfew, testing each step to avoid the creaky spots. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a rental house built in the 70s. Concrete floors, exposed beams, that particular smell of damp cardboard and forgotten things. Our storage sections were clearly marked with masking tape and Sharpie, each tenant's name in Walter's blocky handwriting. Behind a wall of stacked boxes and an old refrigerator that hummed constantly, we could see the locked door. A padlock the size of my fist secured a metal latch that had been added recently, judging by the fresh scratch marks on the worn wood. Jerome aimed his flashlight at the gap beneath the door, and we both saw it at the same time. A thin strip of light, barely visible, like someone inside had a phone charging or a nightlight plugged in. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, just staring at that sliver of light. Then, as if responding to our presence, the light shifted. A shadow passed across it, the unmistakable shape of feet moving on the other side. Jerome grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, and we both scrambled backward, nearly knocking over a tower of Christmas decoration boxes. Neither of us said anything until we were back upstairs in the kitchen, where Jerome poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands and downed it in one go. "We're calling the cops," he said, already pulling out his phone. But I stopped him, some ridiculous part of my brain still thinking about lease agreements and security deposits, and having to find a new place in the middle of the semester. "Let me try Walter one more time," I said. "If he doesn't give me a real answer, then we call." Jerome looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but he put his phone down and waited while I sent Walter a text with the video attached, telling him we knew someone was in the locked room and we needed answers now. Walter showed up 20 minutes later, which should have been my first red flag since he lived 40 minutes away. He was wearing sweatpants and a faded college hoodie, his hair sticking up like he'd just rolled out of bed, but his eyes were wide awake and darting between Jerome and me like he was calculating something. "You kids are being paranoid," he said. But his voice had this thin quality to it, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. "That room's been locked for years. Nobody could possibly be in there." I pulled up the video on my phone, turned the volume all the way up and played the coughing sounds. His face went through this series of expressions, from dismissive to concerned to something I couldn't quite read. "Fine," he finally said, pulling out his keys with dramatic reluctance. "I'll show you there's nothing in there but rusty tools and spider webs, and then I don't want to hear about this again." He started toward the basement stairs, then stopped and turned back to us. "Actually, wait here. Insurance, liability, and all that. I'll go check and come right back." Jerome and I looked at each other and simultaneously decided we weren't letting him go alone. We followed him down, our footsteps echoing his on the wooden stairs. Walter kept muttering under his breath, something about ungrateful tenants and market-rate rentals, but his hands were trembling as he fumbled with the padlock. The key stuck, and he had to jiggle it 3 times before the lock finally clicked open. He pushed the door inward, and the smell hit us immediately. Not decay or waste, but that concentrated human smell of unwashed clothes and stale breath and something medicinal, like cough syrup or benzocaine lozenges. The room was maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a camping cot pushed against one wall, a battery-powered lantern on an overturned milk crate, and grocery bags lined up along another wall. Empty soup cans were stacked in a corner next to a pile of pill bottles. But the worst part was the ceiling. Someone had drilled tiny holes in precise spots, each one positioned perfectly to look up into the rooms above, into our bedrooms, into our lives. "Oh God," Walter said, and for the first time he seemed genuinely shocked. "Gordon, what have you done?" That's when we heard the toilet flush from the small bathroom. I hadn't even noticed in the corner, just a toilet and sink behind a curtain made from a shower liner. A man emerged, probably in his 50s, wearing a dingy white undershirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He had Walter's same narrow face but none of his nervous energy, just this hollow resignation like he'd been caught doing something inevitable. "I told you they'd find out," Gordon said to Walter, not even looking at Jerome and me. "Told you the girl's room was too close. She was bound to hear me." He sat down on the cot with a wheeze that turned into another coughing fit, this one lasting almost a minute while Walter stood there with his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When Gordon finally stopped coughing, he looked directly at me for the first time, and his eyes had this horrible apologetic quality that made my skin prickle. "You take morning showers at 6:15, he said quietly. "Sometimes you sing that song about the astronaut. Pretty voice." Jerome already had his phone out, calling 911 while backing toward the door. I couldn't move, couldn't process that this man, Gordon, had been living beneath me for months, watching through those horrible little holes, knowing my schedule better than I did. Walter started babbling, trying to explain that Gordon was his brother, that he'd lost his job and then his apartment, that it was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks until he got back on his feet. "He's sick," Walter kept saying, as if that explained everything. "He's got respiratory problems, can't afford doctors. I couldn't just leave him on the street." But Gordon wasn't listening to his brother's excuses. He was looking at the holes in the ceiling with this weird pride, running his fingers along the wood. "Had to be real careful with the placement," he said to no one in particular. "1/4-inch bit, just enough to see through but not enough for anyone to notice from above. The one over your desk is my favorite. You study so hard, writing all those notes about medications and patient care. Sometimes I pretend you're taking care of me." The police arrived within 10 minutes. 3 cars with lights but no sirens. They took Gordon away first, and he went without resistance, just asked Walter to grab his medications from the milk crate. The officers photographed everything, measured the holes, bagged the empty food containers and pill bottles. One of them, a woman with sergeant stripes, told us we'd all need to give statements, and that the house would be off limits for at least 48 hours while they processed the scene. Walter they arrested too, for criminal facilitation and endangerment. As they led him to the squad car, he kept trying to catch my eye, maybe wanting forgiveness or understanding, but I stared at the ground until the car door slammed shut. Jerome and I sat on the front steps until our other roommates got home. Then we all went to Bradley's girlfriend's apartment, cramming into her living room with sleeping bags and the weird energy of survivors from the same disaster. None of us ever went back to that house except to get our belongings with a police escort. I found a studio apartment the next week that cost twice as much and had terrible water pressure. But the floors were solid concrete and there was no basement, and that was all that mattered. The closing papers for my house came through on a Wednesday morning in late February, and honestly, I should have trusted my gut when the real estate agent kept adjusting her glasses and clearing her throat during the final walkthrough. But after 6 months of crashing on my sister's couch following the divorce, any place with my own walls felt like salvation. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Riverside Heights, one of those neighborhoods where people still put up seasonal decorations and kids actually played in the yards. Built in 1978, the split level had good bones underneath the outdated wallpaper and worn carpet, nothing that some sweat equity couldn't fix. What really sold me was the price, almost $40,000 under market value, because the previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Brennan, had died in the master bedroom and the family wanted a quick sale. Death didn't bother me. At my age, having just watched my 10-year marriage flatline, I figured I could handle sharing space with whatever energy Dorothy left behind. My first 2 weeks there passed in a blur of unpacking boxes and making lists of everything that needed fixing, from the leaky kitchen faucet to the wood paneling in the den that belonged in a time capsule. The basement became my designated storage area for things I wasn't ready to deal with yet, mostly photo albums and wedding gifts that felt too complicated to sort through. It was your typical unfinished basement, concrete floors and exposed beams, with an ancient furnace that groaned like it was digesting something whenever it kicked on. That's what I told myself when I first heard the noises anyway. Just the furnace doing its 45-year-old furnace thing. The sounds usually started around 2 in the morning, these soft creaking noises that drifted up through the heating vents. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. And after living in a modern apartment complex where I could hear my neighbor's coffee maker through the walls, a few creaks seemed like a fair trade for actual privacy. Everything changed on a Sunday night in March when I went down to grab my winter boots from storage, because the weather guy promised one last snowstorm before spring. The pull-string light barely reached the corners of the basement, casting these long shadows behind the water heater and the massive boiler that looked like something from a submarine movie. Behind the boiler, tucked into a gap between the unit and the wall, I found 3 Marlboro red cigarette butts arranged in a neat little line on the concrete floor. My whole body went rigid, like when you miss a step going downstairs and your stomach does that horrible flip. Nobody in my family smoked, hadn't had a single visitor who smoked, and the home inspector definitely would have mentioned finding cigarette butts during his inspection. Right next to the butts sat a Poland Spring water bottle, the label peeled halfway off, with maybe 2 inches of water still sloshing around inside. The plastic was soft, like someone had been gripping it recently, and when I picked it up with my sleeve pulled over my hand, the water inside was room temperature, not the icy cold you'd expect from something abandoned in a basement for weeks. I told myself Dorothy's family must have left it when they cleared out her belongings, maybe took smoke breaks while sorting through 40 years of accumulated stuff, even though the house had been empty for 3 months before I moved in. But that night, I barely slept, jerking awake every time the heat kicked on or a tree branch scraped the siding. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had him install new deadbolts on every exterior door, the expensive kind that couldn't be picked by some YouTube tutorial. Then I went through every window in the house, checking locks and adding these metal security bars to the basement windows that the guy at Home Depot assured me would stop anyone bigger than a raccoon. For good measure, I started leaving lights on when I went to bed. The kitchen, the hallway. Sometimes the basement too, my electric bill be damned. But even with all that, I kept finding myself standing at the top of the basement stairs at random times, listening for sounds that didn't belong, my hand hovering over the light switch like I was afraid of what I might see if I turned it on. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I had almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted, that living alone after a decade of marriage had made me jumpy and paranoid about normal house stuff. Then came the morning I found my back door unlocked, the one that led from the kitchen to the backyard, the one I specifically remembered checking twice before bed because it had become part of my nightly ritual, along with testing every window latch. The door was still closed, just unlocked, The deadbolt turned to the open position like someone had used a key. My coffee mug slipped right out of my hand, shattering on the linoleum and sending hot coffee across my bare feet. But I barely felt the burn. I grabbed my phone and almost called 911. But what would I say? That my door was unlocked and maybe I was just losing my mind from stress. Instead, I called my brother Kevin, who lived 40 minutes away. And while I waited for him to show up, I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine running, watching my own house like it might suddenly reveal its secrets. Kevin spent 2 hours going through the house with me, checking every closet, every corner, even the crawl space above the garage that required a ladder to access. We found nothing missing, nothing disturbed, just that unlocked door that he suggested might be a faulty mechanism, or maybe I'd forgotten despite being certain, absolutely certain, that I'd checked it. But when we went down to the basement to check the window locks, we found something that made Kevin stop talking mid-sentence about getting me a security system. Behind the boiler, in that same spot where I'd found the cigarettes, sat a McDonald's bag, grease-stained and crumpled, with a receipt dated from the previous night at 11:47 p.m. Inside were the remnants of a Big Mac meal, half-eaten, the fries still soft, like they'd been sitting there for just a few hours. The smell hit us both at the same time, that distinctive fast food smell that definitely hadn't been there when I'd done laundry in the basement 2 days earlier. Kevin's face went pale, and he pulled out his phone to call the police while ushering me back upstairs, his hand on my back like he was afraid something might grab me if we didn't move fast enough. The police treated it like a standard break-in at first. 2 officers who looked barely older than my nephew taking notes while walking through the house with their hands resting on their utility belts. They found the point of entry within 10 minutes, a basement window on the north side of the house where someone had carefully removed the security bar screws from the outside, the holes hidden behind a rhododendron bush that grew thick against the foundation. The frame showed fresh tool marks where someone had pried it open repeatedly, probably over several nights, working the lock mechanism until they'd figured out how to pop it silently. Officer Ramirez, the one with a thin scar through his left eyebrow, showed me how the intruder had been replacing the screws each time they left, making everything look normal from a casual glance. They documented everything, took photos, dusted for prints around the window and the boiler area, but both officers kept exchanging these looks that made my chest feel tight. When I asked what would happen next, Officer Carson, the younger one with freckles across his nose, said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood, but admitted that without cameras or witnesses, catching someone who only came at night would be like finding a specific fish in Lake Superior. That afternoon, I spent $300 I didn't really have on security cameras from Best Buy, the kind that sent alerts to your phone when they detected motion. Kevin helped me set them up, 1 at each entrance, 1 in the hallway, and 2 in the basement, including 1 pointed directly at that window. We also moved my bedroom furniture so my bed sat against the far wall with clear sight lines to both the door and window, and Kevin insisted on installing this metal security bar that wedged under the doorknob, said he'd seen it on some crime show and it actually worked. Before he left, he tried to convince me to stay at his place for a while, but his wife had just had their 3rd kid, and their house was already chaos without adding my drama to it. Instead, I promised to call him every night before bed and first thing in the morning, our own little check-in system that made us both feel better, even though we knew it wouldn't actually stop anything from happening. That first night with the cameras, I sat up in bed with my laptop open, watching the feeds like they were the most important TV show ever made, jumping every time a moth flew past the lens or the timestamp updated. For 3 nights, nothing happened except for a stray cat that triggered the basement camera and nearly gave me a heart attack at 3 a.m. when my phone started buzzing with motion alerts. I'd actually started to relax a little, thinking maybe the police visit had scared whoever it was away, that they'd moved on to some other house without cameras and paranoid owners who checked their locks 15 times before bed. Then on Friday night, exhausted from a week of barely sleeping, I made the mistake of taking 2 Benadryl to knock myself out, figuring the camera alerts would wake me if anything happened. I woke up Saturday morning feeling groggy and disoriented, my mouth dry like I'd been breathing through it all night, and when I checked my phone, there were 14 motion alerts from between 1:47 a.m. and 4:33 a.m. My fingers shook so bad I could barely unlock my phone, and when I finally got the camera app open, what I saw made me run to the bathroom and throw up the nothing that was in my stomach, just bile that burned my throat while tears streamed down my face. The footage showed a man entering through the basement window at 1:47 a.m., moving with the kind of confidence that comes from practice, like he'd done this so many times he could navigate my basement in the dark. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low and what looked like a maintenance company jacket, the kind with reflective stripes that made him look like he belonged there if anyone happened to glance through a window. The infrared camera made his eyes look like white circles as he walked directly to the stairs, not hesitating, not searching, just walking like he owned the place. The hallway camera caught him at 2:15 a.m., standing at my bedroom door, his hand on the knob, just standing there for a full 4 minutes without moving. And I realized with horror that he was listening to me breathe, waiting to see if I was truly asleep. Then he opened the door so slowly that it took another 2 minutes for it to fully open and disappeared into my room where I didn't have a camera because who puts a camera in their own bedroom? The next footage was him leaving my room at 3:58 a.m., walking backward while carefully closing the door. And in his hand was my phone charger, the pink one with the butterfly sticker that I'd been looking for all week, assuming I'd misplaced it somewhere. I called 911 while still sitting on my bathroom floor, barely able to form words through the sobbing. And this time they sent 3 patrol cars and a detective named Heather Novak, who had this way of making me feel like she actually believed every word I said. When she watched the footage, she immediately recognized something I'd missed in my panic: a small tattoo on the man's left hand, a distinctive pattern that looked like interlocking triangles. She asked me about previous maintenance work on the house, and suddenly, it clicked. The property management company that handled the rental before Dorothy bought it had sent someone to service the boiler just 2 months before she died. Detective Novak made some calls, and within an hour, she had a name: Carl Brenner, 43 years old, who'd been fired from Citywide Property Services 8 months ago for complaints about entering rental properties without notice. The company still had his photo on file, and even though the baseball cap obscured most of his face in my footage, that hand tattoo was unmistakable, those same interlocking triangles he'd apparently gotten during his time in the military, according to his employment records. They arrested Carl that same afternoon at his apartment in Fairfield, just 12 miles from my house, and what they found there made Detective Novak call me personally to come to the station, warning me I might want to bring someone for support. In a back room that Carl used as an office, they found hundreds of photos printed from a computer, photos of me sleeping, photos of me cooking dinner, photos of me watching TV on my couch, all taken from inside my house over the past month. But mixed in with mine were other photos, other women in other houses, some dating back 2 years, each set labeled with addresses and dates in neat handwriting on manila folders. He had keys to 17 different properties, including mine, which he'd apparently copied during his maintenance visits, and a notebook where he documented the routines of each house's occupants, when they slept, when they showered, when they were away at work. Detective Novak said in her 15 years on the force, she'd never seen anything quite like it. This methodical invasion of privacy that wasn't about theft or assault, but something else. Some need to exist in other people's spaces without their knowledge, to watch them in their most vulnerable moments. Carl never said a word during interrogation, just sat there with this blank expression, and eventually asked for a lawyer, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutor charged him with multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. The trial happened 6 months later, and by then I'd already moved back in with my sister, unable to sleep in that house even after changing every lock and installing an alarm system that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. During the proceedings, we learned that Carl had been doing this since his divorce in 2017, starting with his ex-wife's apartment, then expanding to places he'd serviced during his maintenance job. The prosecutor brought in a psychologist who testified about voyeuristic disorders and violation of privacy as a form of control, using words like parasitic intimacy that made everyone in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. 16 other women came forward to testify, each with their own version of my story, finding cigarette butts, missing small items, that persistent feeling that someone had been in their space. One woman from Oak Harbor broke down completely when she described finding an impression on her bed's comforter, where someone had laid down next to her while she slept, the shape still visible when she woke up one morning. Carl got 11 years in state prison, eligible for parole in 7 with good behavior, which seems like nothing compared to the life sentence he gave all of us, who can't look at an unlocked door or a basement window without remembering. I sold the house 3 months after the trial, taking a $15,000 loss just to be free of it, and the realtor had to disclose the stalking incident to potential buyers, which meant it sat on the market for 4 months before a young couple from out of state bought it, probably thinking they were getting a deal. Sometimes I drive by there, not intentionally, but that neighborhood sits between my sister's place and the grocery store I like, and I see they've painted it yellow, added a garden, normal life continuing in a space that still shows up in my nightmares. The thing that stays with me most isn't even the violation itself, but this one detail from the trial, where they showed a photo from Carl's apartment of a coffee mug he'd taken from my kitchen, my favorite one with a cartoon cat that said "Coffee right meow," sitting on his kitchen counter like it belonged there. He'd been drinking from it every morning while looking at those photos of me, creating this twisted parallel life where he inhabited my spaces even when he wasn't physically there, and that image haunts me more than any footage of him standing in my bedroom doorway, because it means that even when I thought I was alone and safe, some part of my life was always bleeding into his. September in that basement apartment felt like hiding from the world, which was exactly what I needed. Willow Drive wasn't much to look at, just rows of old houses converted into rentals, but at $600 a month I couldn't complain. 29 candles on my last birthday cake, and here I was, starting fresh after Janet and I called it quits. The landlord, an older guy named Frank, lived upstairs with his wife and kept to himself mostly. During move-in day, the neighbor from next door, Gregory, appeared at my door offering to help with the heavy stuff. He was probably in his 50s, thin guy with calloused hands, said he worked night shifts at some warehouse across town. Made a joke about how our basements were identical, just mirror images of each other, while we struggled to angle my couch down those narrow stairs. Even offered to lend me tools if I needed anything fixed, which seemed neighborly enough at the time. After about 2 weeks of living there, small things in my kitchen started seeming out of place. My coffee mug would be turned handle left when I always left it handle right. The wooden spoon I kept in the drawer next to the stove would migrate to the drawer by the sink. A jar of peanut butter I swore I'd pushed to the back of the cabinet would be sitting at the front edge when I got home from my accounting job downtown. Figured my brain was still scrambled from the divorce stress, especially since I was surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, scrolling through apartment listings for something better while trying to rebuild my savings. Started doubting myself, even wrote notes about where I put things. The kitchen was cramped, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, old appliances that hummed too loud, cracked linoleum that curled at the edges. Then came that Wednesday in October when things got harder to explain away. Left for work at 7:30 sharp like always, and I specifically remember washing my breakfast bowl and placing it upside down on the dish rack. When I got home around 6 that evening, the bowl was right side up with 3 drops of water pooled at the bottom, not just moved but used. The dish soap bottle had shifted from the left side of the sink to the right, and there was a different sponge on the counter, still damp. Called Frank immediately, asked if he'd sent someone down for maintenance, or if maybe his wife had needed to check something. He sounded confused, said nobody had any reason to enter my apartment, reminded me I had the only key besides his emergency copy, which was hanging in his kitchen where it always stayed. That night, I couldn't settle down. Kept getting up to double-check the deadbolt, even wedged a chair under the doorknob like my dad used to do when we stayed in sketchy motels during road trips. Around 2 in the morning, lying there in the dark, listening to the furnace cycle on and off, I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The distinct sound of a drawer sliding open in my kitchen, that specific sticky catch the silverware drawer made because of the humidity. Then the soft rattle of utensils followed by the drawer rolling shut. My bedroom was only about 15 feet from the kitchen, just a thin wall between us. I held my breath, phone already in my hand, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Could hear my pulse hammering in my ears while I waited, listening for footsteps, for any other sound. Another drawer opened, the one with the heavier sound, where I kept the dish towels and oven mitts. The intruder was methodical, unhurried, like someone familiar with the layout. I pressed 911, whispered to the dispatcher that someone was in my apartment, gave the address twice to make sure she got it right. She told me to stay where I was, keep the door locked, officers were on their way. But then I heard something that made no sense at all. The microwave door opened and closed, followed by the beep of buttons being pressed, but no hum of it actually running. Just someone pressing buttons in the dark. The fridge opened next, that broken seal making its characteristic sucking sound, and I could hear containers being shifted around, the clink of glass jars touching. The sirens came within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours lying there listening to someone moving through my kitchen, like they owned it. When the red and blue lights started flashing through those ground-level windows, the sounds stopped instantly. Not gradually, not with footsteps running away, just stopped like someone had hit a switch. The officers knocked loud, announcing themselves, and I practically ran to let them in, explaining about the sounds, pointing toward the kitchen. 2 of them went in with flashlights while a third stayed with me by the door. They checked everything, the closets, the bathroom, behind the water heater, even looked up at the ceiling tiles. The kitchen drawers were all closed, nothing visibly out of place, but I knew someone had been there. The younger officer, Officer Daniels according to his badge, started asking about windows, pointing out that they were all locked from the inside with no signs of tampering. The door showed no damage either, deadbolt still solid. The older cop, Officer Ruiz, was running his flashlight along the walls, checking for any openings, when he stopped at the back corner of my bedroom. There was a section of wood paneling that looked slightly different from the rest, the grain pattern not quite matching. He pushed on it, and it gave way slightly, like it wasn't properly secured. Called his partner over, and together they pulled at the edges until the whole panel came loose, revealing a rough opening about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Behind that panel was pure darkness that their flashlights couldn't quite penetrate at first. Officer Ruiz got down on his knees, aimed his light inside, and immediately pulled back, calling for backup on his radio. The crawl space extended beyond what the beam could reach, with fresh scuff marks in the dust and what looked like knee prints leading away from the opening. They told me to pack a bag, that I couldn't stay there tonight. While we waited for more officers, Gregory from next door came out in his bathrobe, asking about all the commotion, said the lights woke him up. Stood there on his porch with this concerned expression, arms crossed against the cold, watching everything unfold. Officer Daniels went to question him while Ruiz stayed with me, but Gregory just shook his head, said he'd been dead asleep until the sirens. When backup arrived with better equipment, they sent Officer Park, a smaller woman who volunteered to go through the crawl space with a helmet cam and heavy-duty flashlight. We watched the feed on a laptop in the police car, and my stomach turned as the tunnel curved left, then right, clearly man-made with support beams every few feet. After about 30 feet of crawling, she reached another opening, this one covered by a piece of thin plywood that pushed out easily. She emerged into what looked like another basement, and I heard her radio crackle as she described seeing a workbench with tools, shelving units, and a water heater in the corner. Then she turned her light toward the wall and found something that made everyone in the car go silent. Photos taped up in neat rows, dozens of them, all taken from inside my apartment. Me cooking dinner, washing dishes, even one of me sleeping on the couch after a long day. The detective who'd just arrived, Detective Morrison, immediately got a warrant for Gregory's house while Officer Park stayed in position. Within 20 minutes, they were at his door with the paperwork. Gregory answered calmly, like he'd been expecting them. Didn't even protest when they told him to step outside. Inside his basement, exactly where Officer Park had emerged, they found the other end of the tunnel system. But it was what they found on his workbench that really got to me. My missing spare key from when I'd first moved in, the one I thought I'd misplaced while unpacking. A notebook with detailed schedules of when I left for work, when I got home, when I typically went to bed. Even had notes about my coffee preference and which drawer I kept the batteries in. The photos went back to my second day living there, hundreds of them organized by date in a filing cabinet. They arrested Gregory right there on his porch, didn't even let him go back inside for shoes. As they put him in the patrol car, he looked straight at me through the window, no expression at all, just staring like I was still something to observe. Detective Morrison told me later that Gregory had dug that tunnel over the course of 3 years, long before I'd moved in. The previous tenant, a college student named Ryan, had complained about missing food and moved out after just 2 months. But nobody had believed him about someone being in his apartment. They found photos of Ryan too, tucked in a separate folder, along with images of the tenant before him. Gregory had apparently been using that tunnel for years, treating whoever lived there like his personal reality show. Frank felt terrible about the whole thing, refunded my entire security deposit plus 2 months of rent, even though it wasn't his fault. He had contractors come seal up that wall with concrete, no more panels, no more access points. But I couldn't stay there. Moved in with a coworker for a few weeks until I found a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, one with cameras in the hallways and a doorman who worked nights. Gregory got 18 months for stalking and breaking and entering, which didn't feel like nearly enough. Sometimes I still wake up at 2 in the morning, listening for drawers opening, for sounds that shouldn't be there. Check my kitchen twice before bed, making sure everything is exactly where I left it. The therapist says it'll fade with time, that hypervigilance after something like this is normal. Maybe she's right, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never live in a basement again. Mason's mother had been gone for 3 months when the noises started in our basement, leaving just the 2 of us rattling around that split-level house outside Columbus. My son was 9, obsessed with collecting those little metal soldier figures that he'd line up in battle formations across his bedroom floor. We'd grabbed this place in a rush right before school started, one of those 80s builds with yellowish vinyl siding, and a furnace that sounded like it was clearing its throat every time it kicked on. The realtor had knocked $8,000 off the asking price because of the outdated kitchen and the basement that smelled like wet newspaper. But honestly, we just needed somewhere to start over. Mason claimed the upstairs bedroom while I took the master on the main floor, close enough to hear when those nightmares hit him around 2 or 3 in the morning, which happened more often than I'd like to admit. That first Monday in October, I remember specifically because Mason had just brought home straight A's on his report card. I woke up to this metallic scraping sound coming from below, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone filing down a piece of steel. The sound stopped and started in intervals, maybe 10 seconds of scraping, then silence, then scraping again. Mixed in with it, I could hear voices, 2 people having what sounded like a completely normal conversation, though the words were too muffled to make out through the floorboards. My first instinct was to check on Mason since he'd been sleepwalking lately, once even making it all the way to the kitchen where I found him trying to pour cereal at 3 in the morning. But when I cracked his door open, there he was, one arm dangling off the bed, mouth slightly open, those dinosaur sheets twisted around his legs. The talking downstairs continued, casual and unhurried, like 2 guys discussing a project. I pulled the heavy mag light from my nightstand, the metal cold in my palm, and headed for the basement door off the kitchen. The second I turned the doorknob, everything went dead quiet, That kind of silence that feels intentional, like someone holding their breath. I waited there in my boxers and t-shirt, ear pressed against the door, counting to 30 in my head before flipping the light switch. Click. Nothing. The bulb was dead or missing, leaving just a black hole where the stairs descended. I aimed the mag light down those wooden steps, the beam cutting through dust particles that danced in the air like tiny insects. Each stair groaned under my weight, that old wood sound that makes you wonder if the whole thing might give way. The basement stretched out in front of me, mostly empty except for our moving boxes stacked against one wall, and that workbench the previous owners had left behind, its surface covered in rusty brackets and old paint cans. I swept the light across every corner, checking behind the water heater, around the furnace, even inside the utility closet where the electrical panel lived. Nobody. The concrete floor showed no footprints except my own dusty ones from when we'd moved boxes down there. But there was this smell I hadn't noticed before, kind of industrial, like machine oil mixed with something else, maybe rubber or heated plastic. The side door that led out to the backyard was still padlocked from the inside, the tiny window next to it so covered in grime you couldn't see through it even in daylight. For the next few nights I stayed up late, sitting in the living room with the TV on mute, just listening. The house had its regular sounds, the refrigerator humming, the heating ducts ticking as they cooled, but nothing from the basement. Started thinking maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or maybe it was mice in the walls, though mice don't usually have conversations. By Friday, I'd almost convinced myself to forget about it, even joked with my co-worker Phil about needing more coffee to stop hallucinating. Then the following Wednesday rolled around and everything changed. I'd taken a half-day off work to deal with some paperwork at Mason's school. Something about updating emergency contact information now that his mother was out of the picture. Got back to the house around 1:30 in the afternoon, pulling into the driveway behind a white van I didn't recognize. No company logos, no writing on the sides, just a plain white panel van with tinted rear windows and a license plate so mud-covered I couldn't read it. Before I could even process why there was a van in my driveway, the side door of my basement burst open, and two men came walking out like they owned the place. Both wore those neon yellow reflective vests, the kind construction workers use, hard hats tucked under their arms carrying what looked like metal detectors or some kind of scanning equipment. The taller one, maybe 6'3" with a thick mustache that reminded me of a push broom, saw me getting out of my car and actually waved, casual as could be. The shorter guy, stocky with arms like ham hocks and a neck tattoo peeking out from his collar, was already heading toward the van's rear doors. They moved with this practiced efficiency, no hesitation, no surprise at seeing me, like running into the homeowner was just part of their regular routine. The tall one called out something about checking the lines, gestured vaguely toward the street where I could see orange cones set up that definitely hadn't been there when I left. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, keys still in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These guys had just walked out of my locked basement, the one with the padlock I'd checked myself that morning. The tall one was already at the van, sliding his equipment into the back while his partner climbed into the driver's seat. When I finally found my voice and asked what the hell they were doing in my house, the tall one just pointed at his vest like that explained everything. Mumbled something about Columbia Gas checking for leaks. Routine maintenance. Should have gotten a notice. His partner had already started the engine, revving it impatiently, and before I could ask another question, the tall guy hopped in and they peeled out, leaving tire marks on my driveway. The whole encounter lasted maybe 45 seconds, but something about how smooth it was, how rehearsed, made every alarm bell in my head go off at once. I ran to the basement door, still standing wide open, the padlock dangling from the hasp, somehow unlocked. The mechanism wasn't broken or cut, just opened clean, like they had a key or picked it with professional tools. Down in the basement, that industrial smell hit me stronger than before, and I noticed things I'd missed in the dark with just my flashlight. Fresh scratches on the concrete floor near the wall, like something heavy had been dragged. A section of drywall in the corner looked newer than the rest, the paint slightly brighter white, the texture different. One of our moving boxes had been shifted, and when I checked inside, someone had gone through our old photo albums, a few pictures scattered on the floor beneath the box. The pictures were all of Mason as a baby, birthday parties, first day of kindergarten, him with his mother before she left. My chest got tight seeing those photos touched by strangers' hands, and I grabbed my phone to call the police, but then stopped, realizing how insane this would sound without proof. Instead, I called Columbia Gas first, going through 3 different customer service representatives before reaching someone who could actually check service records. The woman on the phone, Sharon, sounded increasingly concerned as she searched their system, finally telling me in this careful voice that no Columbia Gas crews had been dispatched to my address in over 2 years, and certainly not today. She asked if I wanted to file a report about impersonation, said it was a serious crime, that people sometimes posed as utility workers to case houses for burglaries. While she was talking, I walked around the basement perimeter, running my hand along the walls, and that's when I felt it, a draft coming from behind that newer section of drywall. Not strong, but definitely there, cold air flowing from somewhere it shouldn't be. Sharon was still talking about security protocols when I grabbed a screwdriver from the workbench and started prying at the edge of that fresh drywall section. The drywall came away easier than it should have, just held in place with a few finishing nails, revealing a hole about 3 feet wide cut straight through the concrete foundation. Professional work, smooth edges, probably done with a concrete saw, the kind contractors use for major renovations. Beyond the hole was a corrugated metal pipe, one of those big storm drain tubes that run under neighborhoods to handle rainwater runoff. The pipe had to be at least 4 feet in diameter, big enough for a grown man to walk through if he hunched over a bit. I could see footprints in the sediment at the bottom, lots of them, going both directions, and that industrial smell was overwhelming now, mixing with the musty stench of stagnant water and decay. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the end of the tunnel in either direction, just disappeared into blackness that seemed to go on forever. Called 911 right then, told them about the break-in, the fake utility workers, and this tunnel I just discovered leading straight into the storm drain system. The cops showed up within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars and then a detective in an unmarked sedan who introduced himself as Detective Hoffman. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like he'd slept in it, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail as I walked him through what happened. When he saw the tunnel opening, he immediately called for backup and a crime scene unit, then got on his radio requesting someone from the city's public works department. While we waited, he asked me detailed questions about the 2 men, had me describe everything I could remember, their height, weight, distinguishing features, the van, even the way they walked. The crime scene techs arrived and started photographing everything, dusting for prints on the drywall edges and the padlock, taking samples of the sediment from inside the tunnel entrance. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, told Hoffman she could see tool marks on the concrete, definitely a professional job, probably took days to cut through. The guy from Public Works showed up about an hour later, an older man named Eddie who'd been working the city sewers for 23 years, knew every pipe and drain in Columbus like the back of his hand. He took one look at the tunnel entrance and his face went pale, started muttering about how this section of storm drain had been sealed off in 2016 after a homeless camp got flooded out during heavy rains. Said the city had welded shut all the access points, installed security grates, the whole 9 yards, specifically to keep people from getting in there. But here was proof someone had not only gotten in but had been using it as their own private highway under the neighborhood. Eddie pulled up schematics on his tablet, showing Hoffman where the drain ran, and my stomach dropped when I saw it connected to at least 12 other houses on our street, with multiple entry points that led to maintenance hatches scattered throughout the area. Any of those houses could have the same kind of hidden entrance, and the people living there would never know. Hoffman made the decision to send officers into the tunnel while we evacuated to a hotel. Said it wasn't safe for Mason and me to stay there until they figured out what they were dealing with. I packed bags for both of us while trying not to alarm Mason. Told him we were having an adventure, like camping but in a hotel with a pool. Poor kid was excited about the pool, had no idea why his dad's hands were shaking while folding his dinosaur pajamas. Before we left, I watched them send in 2 officers wearing hazmat suits and headlamps, tethered to safety lines in case the tunnel had any surprises. They came back out 20 minutes later with evidence bags full of stuff they'd found down there. Copper piping that had been stripped from somewhere, what looked like mail from different addresses, even a laptop in a waterproof case. One of the officers, his face sheet white despite the exertion, told Hoffman they'd found makeshift camps set up at various points, sleeping bags, camp stoves, stockpiles of food, and something else that made him stop talking when he noticed I was listening. Hoffman walked me to my car, said they'd post an officer at the hotel, gave me his card with his personal cell number written on the back, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if anyone tried to contact me. That night at the hotel, Mason splashed in the pool while I sat on a plastic chair watching him, my phone buzzing every few minutes with updates from Hoffman. They'd arrested 6 people by midnight, all found at different points in the tunnel system, including the 2 guys I'd described from my driveway. The tall one with the mustache turned out to be a former city employee who'd been fired from the water department 5 years ago for stealing equipment. His partner was his cousin, both of them with rap sheets full of burglary and theft charges going back a decade. The other 4 were people nobody expected, a woman who worked at a nearby grocery store, 2 brothers who ran a scrap metal business, and most disturbing, a man who'd been reported missing by his family 3 years ago. They'd been living down there, had turned that abandoned storm drain into their own underground network, complete with stolen electricity tapped from junction boxes and water siphoned from supply lines. The metallic scraping I'd heard that first night was them cutting through pipes in neighboring basements, harvesting copper to sell, and the talking was them planning which house to hit next. What really got me was when Hoffman called the next morning to tell me what else they'd discovered. Those photos of Mason they'd been looking through weren't random curiosity. They'd found notebooks in one of the camps with detailed information about every family on our street, schedules, when people left for work, when kids got home from school, who had dogs, who had security systems. My house was marked as single father, 1 child, no dog, basic locks, basement access confirmed. They'd been watching us for weeks before they even cut through our foundation, knew exactly when they could work without being heard, knew I wouldn't be home that Wednesday afternoon because they'd seen me leave at the same time the previous week for Mason's school appointment. The whole operation was sophisticated in a way that made my skin prickle. These weren't just random criminals, but people who'd turned violating others' homes into a science. The city ended up evacuating the entire street for a week, while they sealed every access point with reinforced concrete, installed monitoring equipment, and swept the whole system for anyone else who might be down there. They found 2 more people on the 3rd day, living so deep in the system they hadn't even known about the arrests, surviving on canned goods and rainwater like some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario playing out beneath our suburban street. We never went back to that house. I broke the lease, took the financial hit, didn't care about losing the security deposit or the penalties. Found us the apartment on the 7th floor of a building downtown, one with a doorman, security cameras in every hallway, and most importantly, no basement. Mason adjusted better than I expected, though he still asks sometimes why we had to move so suddenly, why we couldn't go back for the rest of his toys. I tell him the house had problems. Leave it at that. Figure when he's older I'll explain the whole thing if he really wants to know. The nightmares he'd been having after his mother left actually stopped after we moved. Like somehow his subconscious knew we were safer in that concrete tower than we'd ever been in that house with its hidden vulnerabilities. All 8 people they arrested got prison time, sentences ranging from 18 months to 7 years for the ringleaders, though that feels like nothing compared to the violation they put our whole neighborhood through. 6 months later, I ran into one of our old neighbors at a Kroger across town, a woman named Beth who'd lived 3 houses down from us. She told me they'd sold too, Couldn't sleep knowing what had been happening literally beneath their feet all that time. Said the whole street had basically emptied out within a year. Property values tanked, and the city was still dealing with lawsuits from families who'd discovered evidence of intrusion in their homes during the investigation. Pictures missing, items moved, food taken from refrigerators, little violations that suddenly made sense in the context of what had been discovered. She mentioned they'd found DNA evidence in 7 different houses, proving the tunnel people had been coming up into homes for months, maybe years, whenever they knew families were away. The strangest part was learning later from the prosecution files that the man who'd been missing for 3 years, the one living in the tunnels, had actually chosen to be there, had left his family to join this underground community because he believed society above ground was collapsing. Even now, writing this at my desk in our new place with the city lights twinkling outside, I still check the locks 3 times before bed, still wake up at the slightest unusual sound, still feel that primitive fear when I hear something that reminds me of metal scraping against concrete. The notification from Roomshare popped up on my phone during a particularly rough month in 2022, right when Jenna and I were staring at our credit card statements spread across the kitchen table. We'd bought the house in Denver the previous year, convinced we could handle the mortgage on our combined salaries. But between the car breaking down and her dad's medical bills, things had gotten tight. The basement had its own entrance around the side of the house, a full bathroom, and enough space for someone to live comfortably, so when Jenna suggested renting it out, I figured why not. The app made everything seem so easy and safe, with background checks and verified profiles. And within 3 days, we had our first serious inquiry from someone named Thomas Brennan, who said he worked nights at a warehouse and just needed a quiet place to sleep during the day. Thomas showed up on a Saturday morning to view the space, and I remember thinking how unremarkable he looked. Just an average guy in his 40s with thinning brown hair and clothes that seemed deliberately chosen to blend in, khakis and a plain blue polo shirt. He barely spoke above a whisper when he talked, had this way of nodding along to everything we said, and paid 3 months up front in cash, which should have been my first red flag, but honestly just felt like a relief at the time. He moved in with just 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, said he traveled light because of his job, and for the first couple weeks everything seemed perfect. He was so quiet we sometimes forgot he was even down there, never asked for anything, never complained about the old water heater that made that weird knocking sound, and always left his rent money in an envelope taped to our back door on the 1st of each month, even though I told him he could just transfer it through the app. About a month in, Jenna started mentioning these little things that didn't quite add up, like how she'd never heard him use the microwave or the TV we'd left down there, never smelled food cooking, never heard water running except for the toilet flushing occasionally. She worked from home doing medical transcription and said the basement was dead silent all day, even though Thomas supposedly slept during those hours after his night shifts. We'd see him leaving around 9 at night through the side entrance, always carrying the same black backpack, always wearing dark clothes, and he'd return around 6 in the morning, though sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement through the basement window at odd hours when he should have been at work. The strangest part was the darkness. We never saw lights on down there, not even the glow from a phone screen or laptop, just complete blackness behind those small rectangular windows at ground level. One evening I went down to check the water meter, which was in a utility closet in the basement hallway, and noticed Thomas had installed a deadbolt on his door from the inside, one of those heavy-duty ones you'd see on a front door. When I knocked to ask about it, just making conversation really, he opened the door maybe 3 inches, his face partially hidden in the shadows, and explained in that soft voice that he had expensive equipment for his work and felt better with extra security. The smell that came from his room was odd, not bad exactly, but sharp and chemical, like fresh plastic mixed with something metallic, and I could hear this faint humming sound, maybe a fan or some kind of machine running. He must have seen me trying to peer past him because he shifted his body to block my view completely. then thanked me for understanding about the lock and gently closed the door before I could respond. Jenna had this habit of doing yoga in our bedroom every morning, and one day in early December she came downstairs looking puzzled, saying she kept hearing these tiny clicking sounds while she was in downward dog, like someone tapping a pencil against wood but coming from below. Our bedroom was directly above Thomas's living area, and when we both went upstairs to listen, sure enough, there were these intermittent clicking noises, so faint you had to really concentrate to hear them. I figured maybe he had some kind of hobby, model building or something. People who work nights often have unusual ways to unwind, but Jenna started changing in the bathroom after that. Said she just felt weird about it, even though there was no logical reason. We also noticed our cat, Mango, absolutely refused to go near the basement door anymore. Would hiss and arch his back if we even carried him close to it, which was bizarre because he used to love sleeping on the warm spot where the heating vent came up through the floor there. The night everything went to hell started with me jerking awake at 2 in the morning to the sound of water rushing through the walls, that unmistakable whoosh that means a pipe has given way somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and ran to the basement door, pounding on it and shouting for Thomas, but got no response, even though his car was in the driveway. The water was already seeping under the door into our hallway, and I could hear it spraying full force somewhere below. I threw my shoulder against the door hard. Once, twice, and on the third hit the frame splintered, and the deadbolt ripped free from the wood. The basement was pitch black, and my flashlight beam caught the water first, cascading from a burst pipe in the ceiling, soaking everything. But as I swung the light around looking for the shutoff valve, I saw something that made my brain just stop processing for a second. The ceiling was covered in holes, dozens of them, each about the width of a quarter, drilled in precise patterns across the drywall. Some had thin cables snaking through them, others were plugged with what looked like small glass lenses, and all of them were positioned directly under the rooms where Jenna and I spent our time. My flashlight caught more details as I stood there in shock. A desk covered in monitors showing grainy green-tinted footage, boxes of electronic equipment I couldn't identify, and notebooks filled with handwritten schedules and observations. The monitors were still running on battery backup, and I could see our living room from above, our kitchen, and worst of all, our bedroom, all filmed from those tiny holes he'd so carefully hidden in the textured ceiling upstairs. One screen showed Jenna asleep in our bed at that very moment, and another had folders labeled with dates going back to the day Thomas moved in. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me, and Thomas was suddenly there, not in work clothes, but in dark athletic gear. His face completely different without the meek expression he usually wore, now sharp and focused and calculating. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, then at his equipment, then back at me, like he was doing math in his head about what would happen next. I started backing toward the door, keeping the flashlight aimed at his face, and told him the police were already on their way, which was a lie but seemed like the right thing to say. He smiled then, not the nervous smile I'd seen before, but something confident and practiced, and said in a voice much deeper than his usual whisper that I had no idea how many places he'd been, or how many people had thought they were safe in their own homes. Then he moved faster than I expected, not toward me, but to his desk, grabbing something before sprinting past me and up the stairs, shoving me hard into the wall as he went. By the time I got upstairs, Jenna was standing in the hallway with her phone, saying she'd heard the crash and already called 911, but Thomas was gone, the front door wide open and cold December air rushing in. His car was still in the driveway, which meant he'd fled on foot, probably had another vehicle stashed nearby or someone waiting to pick him up. The whole thing planned out like everything else he'd done. The police arrived within minutes, and I took them down to the basement, which was now ankle-deep in water from the still gushing pipe. But the equipment was still there, those monitors still glowing with their sick green light, showing every private moment we thought we'd had. The detective who specialized in these cases told us to pack some things and find somewhere else to stay for a few days while they processed the scene. Said Thomas had likely been recording everything for months, possibly selling the footage or just keeping it for his own twisted reasons. The investigation revealed things that still make me nauseous when I think about them, like how Thomas Brennan wasn't even his real name, just one of at least 6 identities they could trace. The detective showed us photos from other rental properties in Colorado and Wyoming, where similar setups had been found. Always basement apartments, always couples or single women living above, always the same pattern of holes drilled with surgical precision. They found receipt copies in his desk for specialty surveillance equipment, ordered to different addresses, some dating back 3 years, and a laptop with encrypted files the FBI tech team was still trying to crack. The worst part was learning from the neighbors that they'd seen someone matching his description at odd hours, sometimes just standing in our backyard at night, looking up at our windows, and they'd assumed it was just the tenant getting some air, nothing worth mentioning. We stayed in a hotel for a week while contractors repaired the water damage and patched all those holes, though knowing where each one had been still makes my skin itch when I walk through the house. Jenna couldn't sleep for months, would wake up checking the ceiling with her phone's flashlight, convinced she could hear that clicking sound again, even though Thomas was long gone. We had a security system installed, cameras covering every angle of the property, motion sensors, the whole deal, which felt ironic given what had happened, trading one form of surveillance for another. The detective called a few times with updates, said they'd connected Thomas to at least 12 similar cases across 4 states, but he'd vanished completely, probably using another identity they hadn't uncovered yet, maybe already setting up in another basement somewhere, drilling his neat little holes while some unsuspecting couple slept above him. 6 months later, I was grabbing coffee downtown when I swear I saw him across the street. Same height, same thinning hair, wearing those generic clothes meant to blend into any crowd. My whole body went rigid, and I stood there watching as he walked into a hardware store, probably buying more drill bits, more tiny cameras, more cables to snake through someone else's ceiling. I called the detective immediately, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone, and the store's security footage showed someone who looked similar but not quite the same, though the detective admitted these guys were experts at changing their appearance just enough to create doubt. We ended up selling the house 2 months after that. Took a loss on it but didn't care. Just needed to be somewhere he'd never been. Somewhere without a basement. Somewhere we could shower and sleep and live without wondering what might be watching from inside the walls. The new buyers were a young family with kids, and I wanted to warn them, to tell them everything. But my lawyer said we'd disclosed what we legally had to, and anything more might be seen as trying to sabotage the sale. So I just handed over the keys and hoped they'd never need to find out why we'd installed so many locks. The conference in Seattle wasn't something I could skip, not with the promotion hanging in the balance and my boss watching every move I made. Hotels downtown were charging $300 a night minimum, which would have blown through my travel allowance in 2 days. So I scrolled through Airbnb until I found something reasonable. $60 a night for a whole house seemed too good to pass up, even if it meant a 40-minute drive to the convention center each morning. The listing showed a charming craftsman-style place with original hardwood floors and vintage fixtures, the kind of house my grandmother would have loved. The host, Martin, had stellar reviews, mostly from business travelers like me who praised his quick responses in the peaceful neighborhood. I booked 5 nights without hesitation, figuring I'd just need a clean bed and a hot shower after 12-hour days at the conference. Martin met me at the house on Sunday evening, right as the October rain started picking up. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with perfectly combed hair and clothes that looked like he'd ironed them twice. His handshake lasted a beat too long, and he maintained this intense eye contact while explaining the house rules, like he was trying to memorize my face. The place was exactly as advertised, maybe even nicer, with fresh flowers on the dining table and a welcome basket full of local coffee and snacks. He walked me through each room, pointing out the thermostat, the Wi-Fi password taped to the router, the extra towels in the linen closet. When we reached the hallway, he stopped at a white door near the kitchen and his whole demeanor shifted. His voice dropped lower, more serious, as he explained that this was the basement door, and it needed to stay locked at all times. Something about ongoing renovations, exposed wiring, insurance liability, the usual concerns that property owners have. He actually pulled on the handle to show me it was secured, then watched me nod in understanding before his smile returned. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I'd leave early for the conference, grabbing coffee from the kitchen while the house sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness, and return after 10 each night, too exhausted to do anything but shower and collapse into bed. The house had this settled quietness that old places develop, with the occasional creak of wood, adjusting to temperature changes, or pipes ticking behind the walls. On Monday night, I'd actually stood in the hallway eating takeout Chinese food, staring at that basement door while wondering what kind of renovation required such strict warnings. The door looked ancient, with layers of white paint that had yellowed at the edges, and an old-fashioned keyhole beneath the modern deadbolt Martin had installed. I even bent down once to peek through the keyhole, seeing nothing but black, before feeling ridiculous and heading to bed. Wednesday changed everything. The conference ended early due to a speaker cancellation, so I got back to the house around 6 instead of my usual 10:30. I decided to take advantage of the extra time, pouring myself wine from a bottle I'd bought and settling onto the couch with my laptop to review presentations. The house felt different in the evening light, more lived in somehow, like someone had just stepped out for groceries. Around 8, while I was deep in a spreadsheet, I heard this rhythmic creaking from somewhere below. My first thought was the washing machine, maybe on an automatic cycle, but Martin hadn't mentioned any appliances in the basement. The sound continued for maybe 10 minutes, steady and deliberate like footsteps pacing back and forth on old wooden stairs. I actually muted my laptop and pressed my ear to the floor, trying to locate the source, but the moment I did, the sound stopped completely, as if someone down there had heard me listening. I texted Martin about the noise, trying to keep it casual, asking if there was any automated equipment in the basement that might be running. He replied within seconds, which struck me as odd for 8 at night, saying it was probably just the old boiler system settling for the evening and apologizing if it disturbed my work. His response should have been reassuring, but the speed of it, like he'd been waiting for my message, made me uneasy. I went back to my spreadsheets, but concentration was impossible. Every small sound made me look up, and I found myself glancing repeatedly at that hallway where the basement door waited. Around 9, I heard what sounded like metal scraping against wood, just once. Brief but distinct. I grabbed my phone to text Martin again, but stopped, realizing how paranoid I'd sound complaining about every little noise in an old house. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. I lay in the darkness of the guest bedroom, listening to the house breathe around me, trying to separate normal settling sounds from anything else. Sometime after midnight, maybe closer to 1, I heard the definitive sound of footsteps beneath the floorboards. Not the random creaking of old wood, but a clear pattern. 7 steps one way, a pause, 7 steps back. The counting became automatic, something my brain did without permission, and with each repetition, the pause grew longer. During one of these pauses, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed. The distinct sound of a doorknob turning, that specific metallic click and release. I knew immediately which door it was, even from the bedroom. My phone was in my hand before I'd made the conscious decision to grab it, thumb hovering over the emergency call button while I strained to hear what would come next. The footsteps that followed were different, heavier and more deliberate, moving through the hallway toward the living room. I could track them by the way different floorboards complained under the weight, each creak mapping out a path through the house I'd walked myself just hours earlier. They stopped near the couch where I'd been working, and I heard the unmistakable sound of papers rustling. My work documents were still spread across the coffee table, including contracts with my company's letterhead, my business cards, even my travel itinerary with my home address printed at the top. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like someone reading, absorbing information. Then came a sound that nearly made me call out, the wine glass I'd left on the table being picked up and set down again, the faint ring of glass meeting wood echoing in the darkness. I did the stupidest thing possible. I got out of bed and crept to the bedroom door, pressing my face against the wood to listen better. The living room was maybe 20 feet away, a straight shot down the hallway, and whoever was out there would only need to turn the corner to see my door. But I had to know if this was real or if I was having some kind of exhaustion-induced breakdown. My hand found the doorknob, turned it with excruciating slowness to avoid any sound, and I opened the door just enough to peer out with one eye. The hallway was dark, but streetlight from the living room windows created this dim gray twilight, enough to see shapes and shadows. And there, standing beside the coffee table with my papers in his hands, was Martin. He was wearing different clothes than when he'd met me on Sunday, a worn undershirt and sweatpants like he'd been sleeping. But what made me pull back and nearly gasp aloud was realizing he was barefoot, and his feet were dirty, covered in what looked like dust or soil, leaving faint prints on the hardwood floor. I closed the door with infinite care, turned the lock so slowly that it took nearly 30 seconds for the bolt to fully engage, then backed away until my legs hit the bed. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more insane than the last. Maybe he'd forgotten something important and had a spare key. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe he was checking on the property. But none of that explained why he'd come through the basement or why he was going through my personal papers at 1 in the morning. I could hear him moving again, those dirty feet padding across the floor toward the kitchen. The refrigerator opened, stayed open for maybe a minute, then closed. Water ran in the sink. Normal sounds that became terrifying because they shouldn't be happening. I started recording video on my phone, not of him, but of the door crack where light might show movement, evidence that I wasn't imagining this. The next sound was worse than anything before. The squeak of weight settling onto the couch springs, like he was making himself comfortable in the living room. I could picture him out there, maybe still holding my papers, sitting in the dark just 30 feet from where I was hiding. My phone showed 1:47 a.m., and I made the decision to wait him out, to stay locked in this room until daylight, then get out and never come back. But around 2:30, after nearly an hour of silence, I heard him stand and walk back toward the hallway. The footsteps paused right outside my door, and I swear I could hear breathing. This slow, measured rhythm, like someone trying to detect signs of consciousness from within. My own breath stopped entirely, my whole body rigid under the covers where I dove the moment he'd started moving. The doorknob rattled once, just a gentle test, finding it locked. Then nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Absolute stillness before those footsteps retreated back toward the kitchen, and that basement door opened and closed with its familiar creak. I didn't sleep, not for 1 second. I sat on that bed with my back against the headboard, phone clutched in both hands, watching the door and listening to every sound the house made for the rest of the night. When gray dawn light finally crept through the curtains, I threw everything into my suitcase without folding anything, not caring about wrinkles or organization. I waited until 6:30, when the neighborhood would have people heading to work, witnesses around if something went wrong, then unlocked my door and walked straight to my car without looking anywhere but forward. Before driving away, though, I had to know. I walked around the back of the house, my keys gripped between my fingers like claws, until I found it. A storm door cellar entrance, the kind with angled metal doors that lead from outside directly into the basement. The padlock that should have secured it was hanging open, and there were fresh scrape marks in the dirt, where the doors had been repeatedly opened. The grass around it was worn down to bare earth in a rough path that led to a cluster of trees where the property line ended. When the police searched the basement 3 hours later, after I'd called them from a Starbucks parking lot 10 miles away, they found a makeshift living space behind the boiler. A sleeping bag, camp stove, boxes of canned food, and a milk crate full of items taken from previous guests. A watch, several driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, phone chargers, even underwear. Martin had been living down there for months, they said, entering through that outside entrance and moving through the house at night while guests slept above him. The detective who called me later said they'd found notebooks where he'd written detailed observations about each guest, what time they went to bed, their daily routines, phone conversations he'd overheard through the floorboards. My name was already there, along with notes about my conference schedule and a sketch of my face that was disturbingly accurate. They arrested him at his actual apartment across town, where he'd been maintaining the appearance of a normal life while essentially living beneath his rental property, surfacing at night like some kind of human rodent to study the people who'd paid him to feel safe. There are nights when silence feels heavier than usual, like the whole house is waiting for something to happen. I remember one of those nights vividly, mostly because it started out so ordinary. I had just come home after another long evening shift at the diner where I worked. My routine was always the same: drop my keys on the counter, kick off my shoes, and heat up whatever leftovers were still in the fridge. That night, though, when I walked through the kitchen, I noticed a faint glow coming from the hallway that led to the basement door. The light was on down there, which didn't make sense. I never used the basement except to store tools and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. At first, I laughed it off, thinking I must have flipped the switch by accident one morning when I was half awake. Still, something about that dim yellow light spilling under the door made me uneasy. The basement always had this strange, still air about it, like time stopped at the bottom of those steps. I opened the door and stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I was just being ridiculous. The bulb buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the concrete floor. I almost turned it off right then, but curiosity got the better of me. When I went down, I noticed how thick the dust layer had gotten since the last time I'd been there. You could see every small print from mice, the outline of old pipes, and my own footprints from months ago. Near the far wall, close to the furnace, I spotted something new. A few half-formed boot prints, much larger than my own. The shape was distinct, almost recent, like someone had walked there not long ago and disturbed the dust just enough to leave a clear mark. I told myself maybe the plumber had left them when he came by earlier that year, but deep down, I knew he never walked that far in. That image of those footprints stuck with me the rest of the night. I went back upstairs, double-checked every lock, and tried to sleep with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint metallic sound echoing through the vents, like something lightly brushing against the inside of the ducts. Came again, slower this time, followed by a hollow tap that seemed to move across the house. I stared at the ceiling, counting each sound, pretending it was just the heating system settling. But the truth was, I had never heard those noises before. The next morning, I checked the basement again, hoping to find something that would make sense of the noise. Everything looked the same cold air, same quiet hum from the furnace. Still, I could not stop staring at those footprints. I knelt down, touched the dust, and realized the top layer seemed freshly disturbed again, like someone had stepped there after I had gone upstairs. I told myself it must have been airflow from the vents, or maybe a small animal. But that explanation did not sit right. The house was sealed up tight, and I had not seen a single mouse in years. 2 nights later, the metallic sounds returned, sharper this time. They moved from one vent to another, like something crawling through the ductwork. Then came a faint whiff of cigarette smoke. It was so subtle that I almost ignored it, but the smell lingered long enough for me to notice where it came from, the vent near my bed. I sat there for what felt like an hour, just listening. The furnace was off. The house was still. But that smell, cheap, acrid tobacco, seeped out from below, mixing with the stale air of my room. I could not remember the last time anyone had smoked inside this house. I barely slept that night, and when dawn came, I decided to check the basement again. The air down there was heavier, colder, and the smell of smoke was stronger. I noticed a few ashes on the concrete near the furnace, tiny gray flakes scattered close to the vent opening. That was when I noticed something odd behind the furnace. There was a narrow panel of metal, slightly misaligned. When I crouched and looked closer, I realized it was not part of the furnace at all, but a piece of sheet metal wedged over a small opening in the wall. Behind it, A dark void stretched deeper than I could see. I hesitated before pulling it aside. The sound of my own breathing filled the room. When I finally shifted the metal enough to look inside, a faint draft hit my face, cool and stale. The crawl space was cramped and uneven, with old insulation hanging like cobwebs. I shined my phone's flashlight in and saw a few things that made my chest tighten. A crumpled blanket, an empty can of beans, and a half-burned cigarette resting on a brick. Someone had been staying down there, watching, listening. I backed away slowly, not sure what to do next. I stood there, gripping the edge of the furnace, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. It was not just that someone had been living down there, it was that they had been close enough to hear everything I did. Every step, every door opening, every phone call. I thought about the faint sounds I'd brushed off for weeks. It all fit together now in the worst possible way. The vent outside must have been their entrance, hidden behind the shrubs near the side of the house. I never noticed it before because I hardly went back there. I backed away and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. The dispatcher told me to wait outside until officers arrived. Standing in the driveway, I could see the faint glow of my basement light through the small window near the ground. It was strange, knowing that someone might still be in there, maybe watching me from the shadows. When the officers finally arrived, they went inside with flashlights and weapons drawn. I heard one of them yell something, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the floor. They pulled out a man who looked like he had not slept in days. His clothes were filthy, and his eyes darted around like a cornered animal's. The officers said he had been sneaking in at night through the vent, hiding in that crawl space whenever I was home. There were food wrappers, cigarette butts, and even a small radio tuned to static. He had made himself comfortable in my walls, using the ducts to listen to me move from room to room. The realization made my chest feel hollow. I had been living above him, completely unaware, for who knows how long. After they took him away, I had every vent sealed and the crawl space welded shut. The house felt different after that. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. Sometimes late at night, I still catch myself glancing toward the basement door, half expecting to see that faint yellow light seeping out again. It has been months since it happened, but I cannot shake the feeling that the silence in this house is not empty anymore. It feels like it is waiting, listening, just like he once did.